This is the paddock build, and it's also the biggest build we've taken on. Now let me take you back to the beginning.
It's a bit ropey, this one.
This whole build started with a message to Matt, and it just so happened
I just bought my dream house again.
and his dream house had an old paddock.
This is everything we're going to need to build a paddock.
But before this becomes a paddock, we need to pull down this old building, which, looking at it, isn't going to take a lot.
I'm Mat Armstrong, and this is going to be my paddock.
Before any of that, we needed to get all of the materials off the MGN lorry, loaded out, ready to go, before moving on to pulling down that old building using a digger, which was quite an easy task, to be honest. So this building didn't take much to pull down. Got a skip in, and it was time to start cleaning up the mess we'd made. Right, the old building is gone, and we've also cleaned the existing pad, and we've discovered some cracks. So we're actually going to be repairing these and showing you how you can save an old pad like this. Ash is going to be laying in our damp course, so he's going to be talking you over all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so basically I've been called in today to get this pad squared up and to a set level for her.
And what that means is pulling a load of lines and making sure everything is completely parallel when we lay in our damp course, because currently the pad that's been poured isn't completely square. So we pull some lines, check our parallel measurements, and then we check our diagonals, which is the last measurement you need to do to make sure it is completely square. And then the last job is to measure the pad and see how out it actually is. While that mixes, I'm going to ask Ash what it is, so I know and you know. So what is the actual mix in here, like what we're using ratio
Right,
wise?
so because we're coming out of the ground and we're using an engineering brick, which is a hard brick, we're using a 3-to-1 mortar mix. You basically use this, which is called mortar plasticizer, which helps the durability while you're working with it. Just leave it to work in there. Don't add loads of water in, and it'll do its thing. As you can see, she's starting to come together now. Lovely.
With our mix ready to go, I did some final clean up on the pad. The lads got the cement poured into a barrow and set up their spot balls, which holds the cement, so everything's accessible when he starts to lay that damp course in.
There's 4.5 bricks in a metre, so we come to there, 4 metres to there, so we know that's 18 bricks in that from there to there. And then you can work it in smaller scales, so 900 again is working brick, so we've got 900 to there, showing us there, as you can see, works perfectly, bricks straight through here. If it doesn't work right to the measurements, you can tweak and open up your perps.
And for those of you who don't know, perps basically stands for perpendicular joints, so the joints that go up the brickwork. So what he's saying is, if it doesn't work out, you can just open them perps up just slightly until the courses work out. So Ash got on with laying in our damp course, and you may be asking why we've got 3 courses going in on the back of this building. Reason is the ground is a lot higher on the back and the left hand side than it is on the front and the right hand side. So what we decided to do was run 3 courses along the back and the left, and then a single course along the other 2 sides, and we also had to put in some slivers to bring it up to level, because remember that original pad isn't completely level, but it will be eventually, and you'll see that happen a little bit later on. The bricks have had some time to dry. Now we can start looking at building our walls, but before we do that, we're going to take our blower, clean the top of the bricks off, and install ourselves a DPC. The purpose of a DPC is to prevent any moisture trapping up through our brickwork and into our timber frame. So we chuck ourselves some CT1 down, and then we roll out our DPC. I always like to go a bit wider. I just think it's a lot better of an install than to go with the exact width you need.
Phil has finished putting the DPC down. I'm going to actually load up this 4x2 wood onto the trestles for Phil to cut to start framing.
So our walls are actually going to be made out of 2 different sizes. So this long wall here and that one are 4x2, but the fronts are not, and I will cover that once we get these built. So let's get them cut down and built, and I'll explain why. All of our studs are cut to length thanks to Mark. Now we can start assembling a section of wall. So I build my walls in 2.4 metre sections. You can build them in place, but this is just my preferred method. So to mark out our top and bottom plate, you take your tape and then we're going to mark on the 400, and because we're coming from the left hand side, I'm going to put a mark on the right, and we're going to do that in 400 multiples the whole way, so 800, 12, etc. And then what we do, using a speed square, we make sure our ends are nice and flat, and then we just transfer that mark all the way through onto both timbers, and that is where our studs are going to go. So we get on marking out 400 centres, and then with our top and bottom plate done, we can start setting out the pre-cut studs we have sat in the back. And another thing you can see me doing there, I'm not just seeing how pretty the wood is, I'm actually checking for the crowns. So every bit of wood has a slight bow to it, and I like to have them all in the same direction. It's a lot easier to set your walls level when everything bows in the same direction. And to assemble our wall, I use 90mm collated framing nails. So we get a few sections made up, and I normally start in the corner. Reason being is, with these two pieces nailed together like so, they're now going to hold themselves. So I haven't got to worry about trying to balance sections of wall. With the corner in place, I can now just keep adding those smaller sections until that length of wall is completely built. That is our 4-inch walls built. So when I said the fronts are going to be different, that is because we're building them out of a wider timber. So this is 5x2. The reason being is it needs to support a flitch beam that's going to be going here, one here, and then there's also a long one that's going to help support the roof. So we're going to get these put together, and I'm going to show you how and why they're assembled. And a quick tip before we start building those walls, we are marking on top of a black DP, so it's quite hard to see your marks. So if you use some like white floor paint, let that dry up, and then when we pencil, it's clear as day. With all of our marks made, we can measure up for our section of wall that we'll be making out of that 5x2 timber. And again, starting off on the corners, because once that's nailed together, it's going to support itself, so it's a lot less likely that it's going to be falling over with any sort of breezes or winds. You won't want to be leaving it in a storm though, I can assure you of that.
And this one has a drop in it, and that's to take the flitch beam that goes across the doors. And I want to take the time just to thank our sponsors for this video, MGM Building Merchants, for supplying the materials in this video.
I'm currently building this second section of wall that's going to go here for our second set of doors. I'm just going to show you a couple things. First thing is, on this corner we need to do a little detail so that the plasterboard has something to fix to when we're finished, so come with me. So on the corner I've got 2 scraps of timber, or 3 depending on the size of them, and we're just going to nail that to our first one, making sure they're flush. And then once you've got those pieces, you can just slide in another stud. Make sure it's nice and tight so it's awkward to get in. There we go. And then we're just going to nail off to them. And I'm also going to nail in the top. And that is a little corner detail that you need to do on one of the walls. You don't need to do it on both, just one of them. And the second thing I want to show you, in this wall we're having a window, so I've marked the position. So this represents the edge of my window. I've then marked an extra timber, and then I've cut a plate to sit here. Our window's actually going from floor to ceiling, so we're just putting that straight on the bottom. But if you had a smaller window, you'd set that up with some timbers underneath. So we're going to nail this in. And now next to this we're going to put 2 full studs like this. This is super tight, almost as if I cut them properly. and then we're going to install 2 shorter ones inside. I could have got away with not doing this, but to demonstrate to you so you know that you can close these gaps up, I'm doing it this way. So basically we're going to cut inside of here and here, slide those in. So imagine if you had a bigger gap, you then put some smaller pieces above, and that's just going to transfer that weight around and down to that bottom there, which is what you need to do with a window. But we're all good, so I'm just going to cut 2 pieces, slide them in, and this is ready to go in.
I have no idea why I was breathing like I'd just run a marathon, but anyhow, we get that wall into position with that lovely little corner detail installed, and all that's going to do is just pick up the plasterboard when we come to install it and save a load of messing about if you don't. It was then on to the corner that's going to be holding some flitch beams, and later on in the video you'll see that I've actually made this completely wrong and we had to modify it while it was in position. So it just goes to show proper planning is always required.
Now that all the walls are prepared and up, we can now move on to showing you how we build our flitch beams. So we've got our 10mm plate. These change depending on how much weight they need to hold, and then we've also got some 6x2 timber to cover both sides. So we need to first drill a load of holes at 400 centres.
Before we make these flitch beams up, we're going to have to get them all prepped, and this is raw metal, and if we just sandwiched it on the building they could rust. So just add in a bit of zinc galvanised spray beforehand will make these steels last a lot longer.
Brad then got on with what I can only describe as the worst paint job I've ever seen. I wouldn't let him near a vehicle anytime soon. With them all sprayed and protected, I got on with marking out our 400 centre holes, and another thing you also have to do is we step them. So on this 150x10 plate, I actually mark them 50mm from the bottom and 50mm from the top, so they sort of go up and down the whole length. And I also come in 100mm from the edges. With that all drilled out, we can place it onto our timbers, and then I've made a bit of a mistake on this. I should have stacked both timbers underneath, but I didn't realise my drill bit would reach all the way. So after this flitch beam, we actually changed to stacking both timbers underneath and drilling all the way through. The reason you can see those bolts in position is we like to twist our timbers straight as we drill. So we use those to hold the timber in position, and then we drill all the way through before sandwiching that plate in between both timbers and absolutely mashing those coach bolts all the way through. They're an M12 coach bolt. We're then going to be turning it over, adding some square plate washers, and obviously the nuts to hold it all in place before cranking it nice and tight, making sure every single bolt is tight and we haven't missed anything before cutting off the extra on the thread, and then giving it a little spray with zinc spray just to prevent any rusting on those cut edges.
Right, now that these are built, we're going to sit them on our ladders, and me and Liam are going to put it into position. Oh, you're definitely going to want 2 people with these as well, because they're not light. I am definitely backwards. Not like that.
Wow, could have fooled me.
Jesus Christ! Oh, I was definitely a bit too low on that one. You okay?
Yeah.
I didn't want to move this end until you was ready.
With the first flitch in position, we used some timber locks to screw it into place. We actually went through the top as well with some 200mm timber locks before moving on to our second flitch. So this is actually 2 out of 6 total that we actually installed. Got into place, locked it down, and we was ready to move on.
With our flitch beams in and fixed, we can now move on to our second top plate. So the reason we have 2 is to lap our sections of wall. Oh my God. I look so professional right up until then. So to lap our sections of wall, and that's going to basically tie each piece into the previous piece. So we're going to go around, nail down a second top plate, and then we can move on to our blocking, noggins or dwangs.
The second top plate, there really isn't much to it. We're just literally putting full lengths of timber
onto the top of the previous top plate, making sure to lap any previous joins. And as I said, it's just locking all the sections that we've built fully together, and I'm nailing it all down with those collated 90mm nails. And while we was doing that, I actually installed this triple beam in position of where our third flitch beam is going to be going. The reason we're doing that is so it can properly take the load of the roof that it'll be holding and transfer it down to that brickwork. Once that was all done, it was time to move on to our noggins, blocking, or if you're from Scotland, dwangs. And the way I do mine is to measure up from the inside of that sole plate or the bottom plate 1200mm, and then I use a chalk line to ping a line ready to put on all of my blocking. Now the electricians hate me going to 1200, but I try to explain that's not the floor level that I'm going off of. I'm going from the inside of that sole plate. So you're still going to be able to fit your switches in at the regulations of 1200. So the age-old argument of straight or staggered noggins, mine are always straight. I just think it looks a lot better, and it also makes insulating a lot easier. So I just nail in at one end and then I spike through from the other side where I've previously installed a noggin. Nice and easy, and the finished look is just a lot cleaner in my personal opinion. And I think you'll agree it does look very nice when they're straight, but there's nothing wrong with staggering if you want to. It's now time to move on to bolting the building down, but before we do that, we need to make sure our walls are straight because they can sort of S in and out. So we grab a couple of nails and then come around the corner. So don't put it on the actual wall we're making straight. Come around the corner, just tap that in. And if you grab your string line or your chalk line, either will work. Hook it on, and then we're going to run it down to the other side and put another nail in. And then we can pull this line nice and tight, like that. So we grab 3 random scraps of timber, and they're all the same thickness. And we're going to put one on each end behind our line. So we'll wedge one in here, and the same on the opposite end. Like that. That's it. So now we use the third one, and that's going to check what our wall's looking like. So if you look, we've got a very large gap. If I come closer, we've got a big gap here, which is telling us this whole wall needs to come out. So we'll adjust the wall and then we can bolt it down. Spot on. Once I'd got over my happiness and my cheesy grin was gone, we could get on with bolting down our building. So we drill some 14mm holes, and we're going to be using some M12 threaded bar, nuts and washers. The reason we go slightly bigger with our holes is because we're going to be using some Chem Fix, and we need that space to get the adhesive around that threaded bar. That way it'll be able to tie into that brickwork, and sometimes the concrete pad, depending on where we're bolting it, giving that wall something nice and solid to anchor down to. So we twist it in, making sure that Chem Fix is all the way through the thread before letting it set. Once it's fully set, then we can go back around and ratchet that building down, making sure everything is super tight and fixed. Those 2 main walls are bolted down. However, on the openings, it's the same thing to get this square. So you can't just do your wall and then don't worry about the door, because it's very easy for this little corner, for instance, to be stepped in, and then your doors will sit at an angle. So we've actually got 2 on this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to wrap my line all the way around the corner, put our blocks in, and I'll show you how to set this so that your opening is completely parallel. I don't think my line's ever been pulled out further than that. So on our corner, we're going to do The same thing with the blocks, except now we've got a couple more because now we've got 2 walls to parallel up at the same time. So we're going to have 2 on this outside corner here, like so, and another on this side. Oh, not that one. So now that our line's in place, I'll show you, this wall is too far this way, and this corner is too far that way. And if we come around this side, it should reflect. So because it's too far that side, it's actually too close this side. And then we can go down and check that last bit of wall, and it's actually not terrible, but it does need to come out a bit. So we're just going to go around and just keep tweaking everything until we've got that same margin all the way around, and that means that everything is parallel for our doors. I forgot to mention, the top of our opening is 3.20 meters. We've got some marks on the floor that mark out for 3.20 meters. It needs to be exactly the same before we check with our block to get that parallel line. We need to make sure that the opening is also parallel, so bear that in mind. With all of our walls set completely straight, including that corner, we could get on with bolting everything down. So it's the same process, drilling through. The corner was a bit more awkward because of how small the spaces were, but we made it happen. And then we chem fixed everything and then bolted everything, and now we haven't got to worry about any of the walls moving. And another little tip I like to do on my buildings is to use some lime paint to mark all of the studs. The reason I mark all of the studs is because when we come to rack the building with our OSB, I now know exactly where I can nail. So I nail off the 2 sides, and then using a level, I can mark a level line from that lime paint that I used on the floor. Another thing to note is I'm actually not using 90mm nails in this. I've dropped them down to 63mm because it's only 11mm OSB.
So we're working our way around this building, getting it all racked. And as you can see, Phil has not measured or cut this bit out yet. Reason being is we've got a great method that we're going to show you in just a bit on how to cut your openings out.
So racking, which is what Brad just said, which we've started to do, is basically stops the building swaying side to side, and it also gives us a chance to level up, which we will show you that a bit more closely. But first, we've got 2 boards max on there. Now this corner, you cannot move it, but this way we haven't got any boards, and you'll see easily wobble it side to side. So that's what racking does. It takes that side to side movement out of the walls. With that all explained, we get on with trimming down our OSB. So anybody that's in the UK knows that our sheet materials are sent out at 1:20, and our spacings are always 400. So we always have to trim a little bit off the boards, which is a bit of a pain, but it doesn't take too long. So me and Brad go round racking the 2 back walls before we come round on the front, where we'll be giving you a little demonstration on exactly how the racking works. We didn't show you on these big walls because it's just so tight down there. It wouldn't have been very good footage for you to watch, to be honest. This is the last wall to rack, and this one is actually the most out of plumb, so this is the perfect opportunity to show you how we rack and plumb the building at the same time. So Brad's going to lift it up to our top plate, and I'm going to nail it on one side only. Go up, go up. Right, let that drop in level, let it drop. Come up. That's it. And I'm using 63mm, so I've actually took the 90mm out and we've dropped down to 63. So these will be perfect for the 11mm we're using on the walls and the 18 we're going to be using on the roof. So now that we've got one side nailed, Brad can get the level and make sure the whole building's plumb, so you can sort of push it back and forth. You see he's pulling it and pushing it. I can help push. Is that plumb? Wait. Tell me when. And then as soon as we nail off another line or another stud, that's it, the building won't move, and that is it, it won't move. So just bear that in mind, to just make sure it is plumb. Go and have a look like Brad said. And remember we was talking about not cutting in any openings, so this is a window, so it needs to be cut out. So rather than measuring and cutting, we just use a flush cut bit like this one, so it's got a bearing on the bottom and it cuts to whatever you're going against. So we just use this and we'll run it round, and I'll show you right now. I will need a ladder, I'm only little. Now that we've established I'm short, I can get on with cutting out that window. So something I want to note here, that flush bit I'm using is not the normal one I use. I normally use something called a downward cutting spiral bit, but I couldn't find mine, so I just used a standard flush cutter bit. It does the same job, it's just not as fast as the other one. That's all the OSB done, so the building is completely racked. Now we need to put on our membrane, so this is going to waterproof the walls. So this is just a breathable roofing membrane, so that's what we use. And we're going to start at the bottom and then we're going to lap each layer. So normally it takes about 3 in these garden rooms. So let's start putting this on using our stapler.
You there?
So on most of the membranes, you'll see they've got a lap line. So we just need to bring our piece down to that line at least. You can lap it more. And then Liam's going to show you how good he is at stapling.
Pull it tight for me. Box.
You are really good at it.
Look at that.
Unreal. Poor Liam only popped by to say hello, but we've just got this knack of conning people into doing all of the work for us so we can just lay back and watch. So between the 3 of us, we got the whole building wrapped up, and that was the walls completely finished. We got straight on with building our flitch beam. So this is the biggest flitch beam that we're going to be building on this build because it spans from wall plate to wall plate, and it's going to be splitting our roof into half. So this thing here is basically a still, so it's just an alternative that we like to use in our timber structures.
The flitch beam is fully built and assembled. Now it's time to get it into position, which is up there, and we've got to figure out how.
And when Brad says we, he means me. So the idea I come up with is to leave one side on the floor, pretend I'm doing something, and let him do all the lifting. And then after that, Brad did the same. Look at him, pretending he's holding anything while scattering back and forth. Waste of time. Once he was up, we got it fixed down with some timber locks. So these screws are actually structural fixings, and they are recognised as structural fixings. The battle with the flitch beam is over. Now we can start looking at putting in our rafters. So as you can see, what we've done, we've split the roof into 2 sections. So the span of the rafter isn't as far. So it can take a lot more over a shorter span. So on this side, we're going to be using something called a hanger. So that's going to sit like that and get pinned in with twist nails. But on this side, we're actually going to be sat on top. So we're going to be using something called a truss clip. And what that does is holds it down. So this one's going to hold it up, and this one's going to stop the wind from pulling it off. Now you know. With that all explained, I got on with marking out for my hangers at 400 centres, pretty much like everything we build on our buildings. And to attach them, I'm going to be using a PPN gun that fires out twist nails. And a little tip, I've measured and marked this side. Obviously we need to transfer it over to this side, so rather than measuring it all again, if you just grab a speed square, slide up to your hanger and then just mark underneath, and now we've got our marks for the opposite side and put those on. We're going to start putting some of the rafters in. Reason being, you don't have to do this, you can do your hangers, all of them, but because I'm already here, it makes sense just to chuck these in. We're only going to pin this side and roughly lay them out. Brad's going to put the piece of timber really awkwardly. Whoa! And now it's just less movement, like moving the platform around when we're already here, so we might as well chuck these in. And then we're just chucking twist nails in the side, and that just locks them from sliding backwards and forwards. Both sides. This one's going to be awkward. Make sure you got your goggles on and all. Always forget. Be honest, it's not only me that always forgets to put their goggles on when they're sat right on their head. Anyways, with the protection on, we get on with fixing the rest of our rafters into position.
Now it's time to actually rack the last bit of building we have left before we pin it off, because once we've pinned it, we won't be able to move it.
So what Brad's saying is this front, because obviously we've wrapped it this way, now we need to plumb, and it's the rafters that are going to lock everything in. So what you can do, you put your level on the front before you spike these, and our wall needs to go back. So if you just tap that top plate like that until it's level, maybe one more.
Yeah. Let me just kick off this bit.
I think that's it, isn't it?
That's perfect.
And then once we're level, we can spike that, and then when we put the second half, we'll do the same on the back, and that means everything's locked together. So this wall is locked off of that wall, and so on and so forth. Wash. As well as plumbing our walls up that way, we've got to make sure that we nail these off parallel. So we're just checking our measurements both sides, and then making sure it all matches, so everything's parallel when we come to put our roof on the top of our rafters. With our gaps set, we start to spike in those rafters, and when I say spike, that basically means to put a nail through at 45 degrees down into that top plate. Now you could get away with not doing that and just putting on your truss clips, but I just like the idea of the additional fixings in those rafters. Anyway, with the front done, we get on with fixing all of the back with the PPN and the nail gun.
Now it's time to extend our roof over in the lean-to area, and what we're going to do with that is we're going to be using these big chunky 6x6 posts to pick up that part of the roof, and also making 3 more flitch beams.
Before we can make up those flitch beams, we need to bring down the steels that have just been delivered, and we use an appropriately sized van to bring them down. And as I've loaded them in and got in, Brad thought it was funny to jump on the back and put even more weight over the back of the wheels. I was trying to use the rear camera. That's attached to the door that's open. I was like, why does it mean walling out of position? So you may be wondering how we're going to get the position of our post. What we are going to be doing, we've set a nail in at the far side of the building, and then we're going to use a string line and set it so we're straight or parallel with this building, and we're going to go past where the end of our building, our lean-to is going to be. We're going to do that both sides, and then to get the distance, we're going to just measure off this flat section here and set another set of strings across the back to set where our posts are going, and you shall see that all set up in super fast speed. Who doesn't love a bit of super fast speed? So we get ourselves some stakes, use the incorrect hammer to put them into the ground, but you know, use what you got. And once they're set, we can start pulling in those lines. So we've got one on the back, one on the front, and then we've also got one going across to get ourselves square with that back wall. But just remember, when we're pulling these in, we're always going further than we need to dig, because we don't want those stakes getting in the way of our holes that we're going to be making for our posts. Spot on. Yeah. Mate, on my life, that's 4.8. So that's all of our lines pulled. So we've got our parallel here, one over the back. We've checked the width for the building and it matches here, which it should, as long as everything's square. And then this one here represents our 4.8 meters, which is where our posts are going. So we're going to have one on that corner, one on this corner, and also one smack center in the middle to pick up another one of those flitch beams. So with all of our lines set up, we hit up Speedy Hire and got ourselves an auger, which is going to do the bulk of the work when we're digging out these holes. It just saves you back and saves a bit of digging. With our first hole dug, I get myself a datum line off of the original building because these need to match, and then I mark off the post while it's in the hole. So we've dug down 600, and then using that datum I can cut the top off, and we're also going to be notching out for the depth of our flitch beam. So what that does, that puts the load through the post rather than relying on fixings to hold it in place. So I mark it out, use my skill saw to notch it, give it a few whacks, flat it off with my chisel, and then go again because I couldn't get the full depth the first time because it's quite a deep notch. The reason it's so deep is it needs to take the width of that flitch beam. So obviously that's two 6x2s and it's also a 10mm steel plate. So with that all notched out, we move on to protecting the post with some post tape before taking it back over to our hole and setting it in position ready for our post creep. So I hold it level on both strings, or plums should I say, and then Brad fills the hole up with water and starts pouring in our post creep, all the while disturbing it with a little stick just to make sure it's mixed all the way through. And then we can get on with our second post, which is the same process, making sure it's plumb, fill it up with water and get that postcrete in, and just hold it and keep checking until that postcrete starts to set, which doesn't take too long. It's only about a minute or two before it starts to activate, and you're all good. You can move on to that center post, making sure it's dead central.
So the posts are complete, our flitch beams are built, so we've got 3 more all built up ready to go. However, somebody, definitely wasn't me, has infilled the corner of this post when it was meant to be open to take our other flitch beam. So I'm going to fix whoever's mistake that was, and then we'll get these things in. These flitch beams are so light, what we think we're going to do is we're going to strap it up onto our bucket on the digger. So big shout out to Speedy, saving my back. I'm going to strap it up and then I'm going to lift it up into position, and then we're just going to slide it into those little pockets that we've got on the corner of the building, and hopefully nobody dies.
I can confirm nobody did die, but let's show you what happened anyway. So we set up our first flitch beam because that was going to be the method that we did it. So start at the back and work our way out with the digger. So we strapped it up to the bucket and lifted it into position. Luckily, we had an absolute legend of a digger driver, and he fed that thing in like a needle while Brad jumped up and fixed it down with those Timberlock structural fixings. So they're going to hold it in position, stop it from getting knocked off. With the first one done, it's time to move on to the other two. While I've got your attention, I just want to do a big shout out to MGN Builders Merchants for sponsoring this video. Without those guys, these wouldn't be possible. So if you are in the Essex and London area, hit them up for your building materials. You will not be disappointed.
We've done something slightly different with this flitch beam. We've added on our hangers. So basically this represents up here that we already installed. And the reason we've done that, it's going to be a lot safer and easier to do it here rather than all the way up there when we put it into position. So let's get it up.
So unlike the other flitch beam, Brad had no choice but to actually help lift it. And then I got it strapped up to the digger, ready to feed it in to that central position that we've marked up on the front of our building. Once it was in, we get it fixed down with more of those fixings, and it's time to move on to the last flitch beam.
Great success! With all of our beams in position, we can now continue our rafters through using the PPN gun on the hangers, and then I'm also going to be spiking in the ends where the flitch beam is over here. So we're going to get these all in and nailed off.
So I got on with installing the rafters, remembering I'm not cutting any of these rafters to length. That's going to happen a little bit later on. So we're just sliding them in full length, 3.6 meter lengths. And then who turns up? Mr. R. Davis Electrical. And we've conned him in to helping us just like we do everybody else, which actually saved us a lot of time. So while he was spiking off the other side, I started to PPN the brackets this end and cut them all down. So it was a lot faster of a process when two people were working. Brad.
All the rafters are installed. Our next step before we go cutting them all to length is to install a ladder. So basically what we're going to be doing is cutting some little noggins, oversizing them and attaching them through the back of this and also into this top plate here. And then once they're all installed, again at 400 centres, we'll cut them in a straight line, which we're going to show you. And then we're going to be putting a big plate all the way round. So let's get on to installing our ladder. We've had a change of plan. Before we build this ladder, we're actually going to cut this front section to size, and then we're going to use all of these offcuts to build our ladder to save on timber. So to do that, I've just measured out 250. We want a total of 300 millimeters overhang on our eave or soffit. So I'm actually only cutting this to 250, and then when we put our front plate on at 50 mil, that'll bring us to 300. So I've just put a nail in this side, and then I'll go down to the other side, do the same again, and then we'll ping our chalk line, and that'll be that done. Now that I've got my chalk line all the way across the top, I'll just use my speed square just to mark a straight line on one side. So I'm right-handed, so I normally mark the left. And I'm going to grab my skill saw and we're just going to chop all of these off.
With everything marked, I grab my rear handle DeWalt skill saw and I start chopping off all of those rafters to length. The reason we do it this way is if you measure them all, you might end up with some waviness as you look down that fascia. So this is just a lot better of a process. So with everything cut, we start to nail on our ring beam, which is basically a piece of timber that nails onto the front, and that's it.
So we've got our offcuts and we've also started to put on our ring beam because we was down there and it's a long way back here, so we thought we'd just do it on the way back. So everything's just being overhung further than it needs to be. So these are the offcuts, and then at 400 centres, pretty much like everything we build, we're just going to sit these in place on the previous rafter that we set back off that wall. So then we just nail through on the previous rafter like so. And then we're also going to spike it into our top plate, which is this here. And then we just make sure we're square to the previous 355, which is the gap you should have on 400 centres. And then we just spike down into that top plate.
Just remember, we're not measuring any of these little pieces we're putting in because it doesn't matter. I'm going to come back around, chalk line them and cut them down. So as you can see, they're all different lengths. As long as they're long enough that we can cut them back, then it doesn't matter. So we get out that rear handle saw again, chop them all down and install the rest of the ring beam that's going to be going around the whole of the building.
Now that the side's done, it's now time to move on to the back. So I'm going to get that done. It's the same as the front. We're going to measure out, cut them all off and install that main ring beam. And then I will meet yous over the back. Welcome to this side. This part of the roof don't actually need a ladder detail. Reason being is because there's 3 flitch beams that run all the way through. So all we needed to do was add 1 length of timber from this side of the roof over to that side. With the ring beam complete, we can now move on to furrings. What furrings is basically like a cheese wedge. So on a flat roof, that creates your fall to get the water away in whatever direction you want. So we have got some 4x2 to create our furrings, and that is going to give us a 60 in 1 fall. I'll explain that a little bit later on. You don't want to get bored right now. So all I'm going to do, I'm going to measure the width of our roof, which we know for this is 6.1 meters, mark it off, and then use our chalk line to ping a line for our slope. Before I ping this, the reason I've got this level here is because it's longer than 1 piece of timber. Just clamp my level to it and that extends our furrings because it's in 2 pieces and keeps them nice and straight. Little tip for you.
and then we just pull this tight and give it a little twang, twang. That's our first furring cut, and this is actually now going to act as our jig for the rest, which I'm going to show you how I set the saw up for that so that they're all the same, and I'll show you what we've created. So this is the little offcut, and you'll see now we go from nothing, which will be the gutter side, all the way up to a full width of 4x2. So that has created a full on our roof, and when you cut these you actually get 2 from 1. So the offcut creates our second furring, so you only really need to do half of the cut. So we're going to get on, cut all of our furrings and get them installed on our roof. To set our table saw up, we set the blade to the widest part of our furring and then use the furring that we've already cut as a jig to run it through. So that way we've got no guesswork, everything's going to be the exact same when we install these furrings, which is very important when we're running water off the back of the roof. So me and Brad got on with cutting approximately 28 to 30 of these, ready to be nailed on to those rafters. Welcome to today's weather report. It is now raining, and I'm sure in 5 minutes it will be perfectly sunny again. So I'll see you then.
All jokes aside, me and Phil actually have to get this roof on today because we're having the flow screed come tomorrow. So no pressure, we've got to get all the furrings done, the OSB on, the rubber laid out to rest. That is the last one, and I just thought I'd like you guys to subscribe to the channel so me and Phil can carry on getting drenched and making amazing building videos for you guys at home.
So the weather has stopped just like the weather app promised. Oh no, never mind, it was wrong. How unusual. So we're going to carry on in the rain, and we're now going to nail down our furrings. So as you can see from that side, you can see what it does. It creates a slope that's going to go all the way to the end, and then that's going to drive all of this lovely rain that we never get down to the back where our gutter will be. You may be surprised that sometimes in the UK it does rain. Not very often, just sometimes. So with the weather in hand, we got on with installing those furrings. So to attach them to our rafters, we use our framing nails. These are all ring shanked, and we nail them through into the rafters below before moving on to the collection of our EPDM, also known as rubber roof. So we haven't unwrapped this, we've left it on the pallet, and we're going to use the digger to lift it up, transport it to our building and lift it up onto the roof. So we've put an OSB board down. It's just going to save us lifting it up manually later on. Once it's up there, it's up there. So with the roof in place, it was time to move on to the 18mm OSB. So we use full sheets of OSB, and to fix it down we use 63mm ring shank nails. So we go up and down, nail on the bulk of the board before cutting it into position. It's a lot easier to cut everything up on the roof rather than bringing it down, measuring it and cutting it. This is just much faster. So we just set the blade so it doesn't go all the way through, and then nail it off, ready to move on to the next board. As you can see, we are up on the roof. So this is 18mm OSB, and the quickest way we've found to do it is to get our full lengths in, and then anything like this, where you can see it just overruns the rafter underneath, I just cut through with my skill saw or circular saw, and I've just set it so it just cuts through the board, cut in position, and then nail off and move on to our next board. And then all these little squares we've left, we'll come back and infill those at the end. So I'm going to get on because I'm pretty sure it's going to be sunny for the rest of the day. Another little top tip, when we're nailing off, what I'll do, I'll put a nail in one end, a nail where I've previously nailed on the next board, and then I'll just carry around a chalk line and I'll just hook it in the centre and ping it off. It's nice and quick, and you're never going to miss those rafters underneath. Some people can eyeball them, but I just find this a bit more accurate, that's all. all of our boards have been fitted. It's now time to install our EPDM or rubber roof, but we're only doing this temporarily. So what we do, we roll it out, we pin it around the sides, and then we'll come back to it in a few days, but for us it's going to be a week because we're actually away for a week. And it gives this time to settle all of the creases. This roof is from Rubber 4 Roofs, so big shout out to those guys. If you are interested in EPDM, go check them out. They've got you covered for all your roofing needs. So with this stuff, like we said, we want to get this laid out and settled for at least 2 days, but we're going to be leaving it for a lot longer. Brad wanted to film, or pretend that he wanted to film, so he didn't help me. So this just shows you can do this job by yourself. It's a lot of up and down because you have to keep unfolding it, but once it's unfolded, it's an easy job just to skirt it about, and then using some spare battens we just nail it off temporarily so it doesn't blow away in the wind while it's settling down. With the roof temporarily held down, it was back inside to fix the cracks that we had in that original pad. Now I need to say this pad is about 20 years old, so I'm not too fussed about it moving. This is just a little something additional we're doing just to prevent any further movement. So these are helicoils, and we stick those in with resin once we've made our cuts, and we just run a bit of resin over the crack itself. It's just a little additional help just to keep it in place for years to come. And with that done, it was time to start installing a DPM, which is a damp proof membrane, and then some 25mm insulation bolts. The roof is on, we are watertight. I've got our first layer of DPM down, and we've also insulated our floor, ready to move on to that liquid screed. But I'm not going to be doing that, he is. And who he is Joe from Screed Pappy. And once you're at this stage, there is a few more steps we need to take before we move on to the flow screed itself. And I'm going to let Joe explain the next step.
So before the flow screed goes in, I'll go around with the perimeter edging. This allows for expansion and contraction.
We're going to be using a stapler. So on the timber sections here, because our walls step down, he's going to be stapling straight into the timber so it sits over the top of that first DPM. And on the brick, he's going to be stapling in to those mortar joints, and that's enough to hold it in position until we're ready for our next layer. Now that that's all explained, the lads get on with installing that foam barrier that's going to allow for a bit of expansion and contraction in our liquid flow screed. So this barrier goes the whole way round our room, making sure that our DPM is behind. Then it's on to the decoupling membrane. I believe that's the correct term. And the reason we need this is the liquid flow screed will actually eat into those PIR boards without it. So this foam that's around the edge, not only is it for the expansion and contraction, it now will become part of the barrier. So it's got this little plastic layer on the back. This is going to lay over the top, and once it's all taped, that's your sort of tank. So that's going to contain all of that liquid screed. Another step that Joe takes is to staple with this weird looking contraption one end of that decoupling membrane and then stretch it down and pin it again. The reason is he needs the minimal amount of creases in this membrane because he said if it's got a lot of creases in it, it can cause issues later down the line. Then it was on to laying out the tripods, getting our datum line, and then setting those tripods to that line. This is going to set the depth of our liquid flow screed.
So you might be wondering why some of these are laid down and this one stood up and this one stood up. The reason is we set these and we want to know that they're set. So when they're laid down like this and we set them, we stand them up and we know that one's set.
Well, thanks Joe. So another reason he told me that we use these is there is a minimal depth you need for liquid flow screed. So he needs to make sure that everywhere has that minimal amount. I believe it was 25 or maybe 35mm. Ours was around the 35mm mark. With those all set, he sprays under each one just in case they get knocked, and it's time to get that pump all set up, ready for that liquid flow screed. And just in time, the pump truck turns up. Right, what's happening right now is they're just doing a little test of the screed. They're going to put it in this little tool here, and that's going to test the viscosity, which is a big word, and make sure it's within range, and then they're ready to start pouring. Another popular term for this is a slump test. So Joe fills up this little tool, pulls it out before measuring how much it has slumped. With that all passed, they clear the line out of the water they put in to prime it, and it was on to pumping in that liquid flow screed. Using the markers he had set on the little tripods, he fills each area up before moving on to the next. Now, it is self-leveling, but it has a particular amount of viscosity, so it's only going to move so far. So it's important that Joe fills up each section to the correct height. He then goes round, removes the tripods, and then it's time to start dapping or dappling. You let me know the correct term. And the reason he does this is to remove any air bubbles in the liquid flow screed. And that's going to give you a lovely finish when this is all set in a couple of days' time. First job we got to do is get some battens installed onto our wall, ready to take our cladding. When it comes to our battens, we basically take an average measurement and then cut all of our battens down to the same size. And then we can start installing them with some 63mm ring shank nails in our D-Walt nail gun. So we're only actually installing battens around the 2 door openings and the window, because this is going to give us the layout of our sill and doors when we come to install them next. So we install these on the studs behind using our nail gun, making sure there's no gaps more than 400mm, and making sure we cover across any openings, including the bottom of the window. Next job is to install some fly mesh. So that's basically this stuff here, and I'm not doing it, DB is. So this is Dan, this is our good friend, and he's basically come here to help us install the window and the doors, but we've roped him into doing something else like we normally do.
As always.
As always. It wouldn't be the Home Improvements channel without us getting somebody else to do all the work for us. So Dan got on with installing the few pieces of batten that we had missed before putting in that fly mesh. So this stuff comes in a roll, you roll it out, cut it to size, and then you just pin it to the bottom of your first lot of battens. And what this does is creates a barrier to stop any creatures getting in behind your cladding and creating any sort of nests, because nobody wants that behind your walls. That is all the battening we're going to be doing for the time being. Now we can start installing our window.
Our first job is to make sure that the base is completely level.
With our best Houdini impression out the way, we get on with checking our base. So the way we do that is to set up a laser level and then a measuring tape to measure the difference. We had a 1mm difference, and trust me, on a timber build, that is pretty good. So we put a 1mm packer where it was slightly low, and then moved on to sticking the end trims on our sills. So this is an aluminium window from Aluminium Trade Windows, so big shout out to those guys. Remember, link is in the description for all of the stuff we use. With that all glued up, we can get that sill stuck into some CT1 silicone, and we also added a little counter batten under that sill to prevent it falling while we install the rest of the window. So we pack the sides to make sure it's completely centre of our opening, and also that it's completely parallel on the front of the building. One last check and we can get on with getting the window in. Breaking news! The weather has changed again and it's slightly raining, but we love it! So we're just gonna carry on. With the monsoon gone, we got on with siliconing the back edge of our sill before lifting in the rest of that window frame. So Dan lifted it into position before making the strangest face ever. I can only assume he trapped his fingers. Once he had got over the pain of that, we start to pack in the sides of that frame, making sure that it's still central of our opening. What's that, Dan?
Huh?
Spot on. As you can see, Dan was super impressed with my input there, and then he carried on fixing that frame in. So we screw through the thermal break that is on aluminium windows with some timber fixings. First frame is in, so that window's in. We're not actually going to install the glass yet because it's going to be easier to do all of the glass at once. So we're going to get on with getting the rest of our frames, which is our 2 bifolds, installed. Just like our window, we always start with the sill, making sure it is completely level before sticking it down and bringing over our frame. Brad did the normal trick of pretending to help, and we all know he wasn't going to actually help. So me and Dan did all the work like usual, and we brought over the pre-assembled frame. So this is a 3-panel bifold, and we lift it into position onto that sill, remembering to silicone the back edge like we did in the window. Once it's in, we can slide it back and get it parallel with the front of the building before opening one of the openers so that we can get to where we're going to be putting our fixings, because obviously you can't put fixings in with the door closed. So I hold that all in position to make sure it doesn't fall out, while Dan marks out for the fixings. So we measure up 100mm off each corner and put a fixing, and then we also split the difference and put a further 3 fixings in, but none of these are tight, they're all loose, just to hold the frame and stop it from falling. Once that's done, we set up our laser level so we can make sure our jambs are completely straight and plumb.
As Phil just said, so basically we're using the laser to make sure we get our jambs absolutely bang on. So what I like to do, if you want to come and have a look, I use a white packer just because we can see it a bit easier. So we run it down the side of our subframe, just making sure that the jamb is absolutely perfect. Right, with all that set up, now what I'm going to do is get all my packers in position and get this fixed up.
So when it comes to your packers, what we do, we want it super tight, and then we put it just above or just below your fixings. So we don't like to screw through the packers because sometimes it can split them. So using those wood screws, we tighten up through that thermal break, nice and tight, and then double check with a level to make sure we haven't pulled it out of plumb. So we've got 3 in the centre and then 2 on those top corners. And as you can see, we like to start on the hinge side and then go over to the latch side after. Here Dan's just demonstrating what can happen if you just go tightening everything up. There'll be flex and it won't be straight. So there's a bit of a big gap at the top here. The reason is I like to leave 20mm rather than 10, because if that base plate is out, you need the space to be able to get everything plumb and square.
A great success!
Well, Dan was pleased with himself. So with all the fixings in and everything plumb and square, we fill the space around that door with some expanding foam before moving on to our second set of bifolds. And these bifolds have been designed to open up away from that corner so that you get the amazing view that you can see from inside, unobscured.
So that is the frames complete. I just want to do a massive shout out to Aluminium Trade Windows for supplying these in this video. Link is in the description below. Let's get these doors glazed.
So when it comes to the window, all we need to do is pack the 4 corners equally to hold the pane central of our opening. So this is a fixed pane, so we don't need to worry about toe and heel. And don't worry, I'll explain that a little bit more when we move on to the doors. So with the corners packed, we can slide our pane of glass in, remembering that these panels of glass have an outside and an inside. So with the glass in, we can fit our aluminium beads, starting with the top and bottom and then getting in our two sides. We then use some packers to hold our beads temporarily into position before moving on to installing our rubber gaskets. So these gaskets are super tight and you will need some lubrication to get them in. And just remember, you should always overcut that rubber gasket because they will shrink back. So we handed this job off to Dan because it seemed difficult and I didn't want to do it. Before moving on to the doors. So the doors are completely different. You have to toe and heel, and we'll put up a little diagram to explain how you pack bifold doors. So you go from the hinge side up, back down and back up, and here's the other side to show how it all works. And what that does is it braces the doors through the glass, and you need that to pick up the weight of these bifolds. Now, unlike the window, the beads on the doors have the gasket installed already. So we lubricate up the glass, as you can see, with all that water running down it before tapping those beads into position. Remembering top, bottom, and then get the sides in. And then it's time to move on to our handles. So these handles are obviously all supplied in the kit, including the locks and keys. So all it is a case of sliding that bar and the handle on before putting in the two fixing screws and making sure these bifolds all operate as they should do.
So now we can move on to finishing the vertical cladding that we started. So we're going to get these in, and remember that very first video we did where we painted the floor. Now it comes in handy again because we're going to be nailing straight into the studs inside with our vertical battens, and we won't miss any of the studs.
Just remember, when we cut our battens down, we just batch cut them to that same size that we did all of the rest. And then we just nail through using those marks on the floor and the level to make sure they're completely plumb.
That is all of our vertical battens on. We are now starting our counter battens. So we've done the back, and we're now going to get these ones installed at 400 centres.
When I mark out for my counter battens, the way I like to do it is to mark off my 400 centres and then just pull a chalk line across and ping it. That way it's a lot less marking out and it saves a lot of time. So because we had already done the back, we just run our chalk from that all the way up to our marks, and we can start nailing off our counter battens using those same 63mm ring shank nails. So as you can see, we've got some pieces here, but that doesn't matter, it's only batten. And once they're on, we can move on to chopping off the overhangs that I leave with a handsaw. It's a lot quicker to do it this way.
Some of you might be asking, what is counter battening? So this is our first vertical batten, and then we put a horizontal across it. Reason being, we're doing vertical cladding. Feed this in here. If we didn't counter batten, we'd lose the airflow that we need to get behind our cladding. If you was going to have horizontal cladding like this, then you don't need to worry about doing the counter battens because you've still got that airflow.
We carried on with our counter battens, making sure they're always completely level. And remember, when there's any openings like doors or windows, you need to have one across the top completely level and straight. It doesn't matter about the 400s, it must have one across that door.
We have installed the cladding on the back because you wouldn't be able to see it on video, but don't worry, we're going to show you the install on this big sidewall, and we're going to be using Thermo AOS or AUS, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but this is it, and we're going to be installing it vertically.
So all of the cladding on this building was supplied by Southgate Timber. They've also actually given us a little discount code for you guys to use, so check out the link, it will be in the description. So a couple things I learnt about this. It originates as an African hardwood, and then once it's thermally treated, that's what makes it thermo AOS. So it's a lot more stable. And I can tell you now, it's really nice to work with. It cuts so easily. The way we're fixing this is to nail through the tongue so they're actually secretly fixed. So if you come over, I've nailed through here, and then when I put on my next ball, it'll get stuck. There we go. It covers up all of your fixings, so you don't have to look at any fixings once this is finished. Another thing that I'm doing, every sort of few balls, 3, maybe 4, I'm just grabbing my level and just checking that I'm still plumb. Sometimes they do wander out a little bit, but you can just tweak the gaps and get it back into plumb and carry on. Another thing to note, if you are fitting any real wood cladding, when you're pinning this, those pins need to be stainless steel. If you're using standard pins, you'll end up with the rust leaking and leaching into the wood, and it leaves nasty stains. So make sure you're always using stainless steel fixings.
So while Phil gets the rest of them timbers on over there, I just want to show you guys that there's a 20mm gap from the concrete base up to the timber, and that's to prevent any moisture trapping back up when it rains and rotting your timber.
Well, that's one way to describe the gap and what its purpose is. So I'll get on with nailing or pinning the rest of this cladding on, always working from my left to my right. The reason I do that is because I'm right-handed. You can go either way. And then with the last piece on the corner, I just use my table saw to cut it down. And then we get that face fixed. So we pin through the face because the corners will hide these pins. Before we move round onto cladding the front of the building, we're going to get one of our pre-formed corners on. So that's a corner, and we're actually face fixing these. And all that means is we're just nailing through the front because you can't secret fix this. So we'll line it up with the top, and then we're just going to nail through the face, like so. So we put 4 fixings in. I'm only going to do it on one side. That way it allows a bit of movement between the 2 sides. Not that this stuff moves very much anyway. Look how cool my glasses are. Before anyone else says it, I know I look like Terminator from Temu. So I carry on in my cool glasses going around all of the openings. When it comes to your windows and your doors, we cut around nice and flush with our battens that we installed, and then what we'll do, we'll rip one of the pieces down, not this is just some rubbish, and then we'll fix that on the inside to where your little reveal is, and then we'll use our corners and we'll miter those round, which you'll see in a minute, and that's how we create the framing for around your windows. So you know, those corners, they're nothing that we've made, they're all available from Southgate. So when we purchased our cladding, we actually got the corners at the same time, so they're made out of the same material. So with that explained, we move on to cutting down the rips that we need for our reveal. So I set my table saw to the correct width before running through our pieces, and this stuff cuts so easily and so cleanly. It's very nice to work with. To attach it, we use the same stainless steel pins, and then we can move on to marking up our legs. They're going to go down the 2 sides of our openings. We've just started on our reveals, and I just want to show you a couple little things. So when you do your reveals, all window sills will have a fall. So if you just cut it square, you'll end up with this gap. So what we do, we grab ourselves a folding bevel, which is just basically a piece of metal that moves around, and then we set that so we've got our angle. For us it's around 4 or 5 degrees, and then we cut that first, then measure up and cut it to length, So that way you get this nice tight fit for when we silicone it right at the end. So like I said, we are going to silicone any openings at the end. So if you do cut your reveals a little bit off and you've got some minor gaps, maybe 5mm gaps, you can get away with it. It's just a lot easier for whoever's doing the silicone if everything's cut nice and tight.
So that is all the infills complete around the window reveals. Now it's time to trim them up, and we're actually going to be using the same pieces we used on the corners, but Phil's got to do some intricate cuts.
Not only does Phil have to do the intricate cuts, he has to do all of the cuts. In fact, he has to do all of the work, Brad. So I get on with cutting out the head or the top piece of my corners first. That's the way I like to do it. So I put on 2 45-degree miters before pinning it into position with those same stainless steel pins. So everything's face fixed to try and make sure your gaps are nice and equal. And then we move on to the sides. So with the sides, I cut the miter and then I mark everything else in position. You can use a measuring tape, but I just find it a bit more accurate to mark it while it's there. So as you can see, that bevel that we did on the reveals is the same on the corners. You still need to put in that little bevel before cutting it square for the front. And then once that's slid into position, it's more of those face fixings. And then when you do the opposite side, try to match those pinholes. That's why you can see me looking around like a meerkat. It's the same process around our doors. The only difference is these corners are only sold in a particular length and it's a little bit shorter than our openings. So we have to put a little join on. That's no big deal. You can barely see it. And because it's a natural product, it still looks great. That is all the trims done on the main building. We're also going to carry the cladding on across the 2 flitch beams. So I'm going to do that in super fast speed and then we can get on with putting the roof on. We all love a little bit of super fast speed. When doing these small pieces, it's very important to always be checking for plumb. Once that was done, we moved on to some knee braces. Because this roof's so far away from the building, they were needed. What is a build without a change of plans? I love change of plans. So we've just found that some of these soffits we was going to use on the roof are damaged because we stacked them like idiots. So we're going to leave the roof pinned for now, but we're going to move on to cladding these posts, which we wasn't originally doing. But now that we've looked at all the cladding, these look a little bit out of place. You know, it happens. So we're going to use the same cladding and we're going to clad these, go and pick up some corners and install them. So we're going to get these cladded and see what it looks like. Guys, just remember, if you're enjoying any of our content, please hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, make sure you click that bell for notifications of any new content we release. So when it comes to these posts, it was super simple. It was literally 2 and a bit wide. So using what we had left, we ripped it down and pinned it to those posts. And we've also had to order some more corners because obviously originally these were never getting cladded. But this can happen with projects. Once it's actually in front of you, you just feel like something needs to be changed. And that's what we did. It's better to change it and make it look better than to ignore it.
So our first job is to grab some timber and cut it to size for our stud wall.
So we build our walls out of 4x2, and because we had sat there and drew the whole design on the floor for Hanna and Mat to see, I just used that to transfer all of my measurements onto some timber. So this design has got a 45-degree wall, so we've got 22.5-degree cuts on all of our top and bottom plates. So we cut 2 for each wall, ready for our studs. So we lay it out onto the drawing on the floor to make sure that everything's going to fit perfectly. Once it did, I then start marking out for all of our studs. Little step I want to explain. So with our walls, I always leave the plate for the floor in and I cut it out after. So we're having a liner, so this is just a liner you can buy, and that's going to be sat here for a standard size door. So I always overmark them now, and then when we build our wall, we've got our opening pre-assembled, and then we mark out for all our studs. And when I say oversized, that basically means I've added 20mm to the width and height of our opening to allow us to plumb anything up when we put in our liner. We then move on to marking out for our studs, remembering we use 400 centers. We've actually moved the studs around a little bit, and that all comes down to switches and isolators. So just remember, when you're building your walls, you need to always be thinking a few steps ahead. So we always make sure we've got space for switches, and we're not going to be getting in the way of any wiring. And once we've done our layout, we can then start installing our studs. So these studs are measured from the floor up to our ceiling joists, and then we just deduct 2 thicknesses of timber, because obviously we've got that bottom and that top plate. We build our walls laying down on the floor in sections using some 90mm nails, and then we stand them into place and nail everything together at the end, because I just find that easier. Our sections of wall are built. When it comes to fixing these in position, you can drill and plug, but because we've flow screeded this and insulated it, we don't really want to break into the top. So we're actually going to be using PGB, which is Power, Grab and Bond from C-Tech, and we're actually going to be gluing our bottom plate. So that's going to replace any mechanical fixings. We get on with putting down our bead of PGB, Power, Grab and Bond. Just remember, when you are putting this down, we don't want to put any where our door opening is, because we're actually cutting that section of timber out later on. So we don't want any glue on the wood we're removing. So we get our first section of wall in, making sure it's plumb in both directions, and then we nail it to the building using some of those 90mm framing nails. I then stand the middle into position, but I don't actually install this. I install the other side section first. Because of the way the cuts are on our opening, you need to install the front last. So we get that all knocked into position, always double checking for plumb, and then we can nail everything together, and then we can nail it all to the building. I also check to make sure our opening is still flat and straight before nailing that up to the roof. Once the 3 sections of wall are in and nailed together, we can turn our attention to those 2 external corners. So because they're 45 degrees, I rip some timber through my saw and infill them, ready to take our plasterboard. Once they're nailed off, we can start looking at putting some noggins in. And because I couldn't sleep at night if these didn't line up with the rest of the building, I made sure that these all run in line with all of the other noggins we had done when we did the outside walls. At this stage, we are now going to cut that bottom piece out where our door's going. So that's the sole plate or the bottom plate. So I'll just use a handsaw, and we're going to go down one of the studs. So using an old handsaw, I get that cut on both sides, and then it's time to measure up for the piece that's going to sit above our liner. So these walls are not supporting, so we don't need any jack studs. We're just installing that top to close it in, and then we're going to put some small noggins in, remembering we've got isolators going above that door. Stud work is complete. It is now time to move on to our first fix electric, so that's the order we like to do it in. So we've set up a laser, and I'm going to start drilling all of our holes ready to put in our cables. If you're not trained in electrics, this isn't a job you should really just have a go at. You may want to speak to your electrician, but I'm going to show you how we do ours. We set in a laser level ready for our sockets, remembering to keep all of our cables in our zones. So in the UK, we have safe zones in the corners, vertically and horizontally from sockets. So that's exactly what we follow. I'm also setting the depth to allow for our insulation and any screws we're going to be using on our plasterboard, just to prevent any potential damage when we come to installing them. All of the holes we need to drill for our socket cables have been done, so now we're going to pull in our 2.5 because we're having a ring main, so that's going to go all the way around and back. If you don't know, ask your electrician. So we're going to start here, pull it up, and then we'll go back to where the fuse box is, which is outside. So let's get our cables in. The reason we're having our consumer unit or fuse box outside purely comes down to aesthetics. There just wasn't anywhere nice to hide it inside, so we opted to hide it around the back of the building outside. So I get my ring main, which is what we're using inside, pulled in for all of our sockets, and I also get some larger cables pulled in for our electric shower and our small heater for the hot tap on the basin.
Before we run our cables for our lighting, we're actually going to do a plan to make sure that we don't hit none of the roof joists. And here's one we made earlier. Let's get some cables run.
When Brad says we and let's, I can assure you that all comes down to me. So I made a plan and then I started to drill my holes, remembering to always allow space for insulation, and then we can start pulling in that lighting cable, which is actually a smaller cable than the one you use on sockets. So the way I do this is to pull the run all the way through where every single light's going to be, and then I come back and pull slack down, ready to take our light when we install them.
So what we're actually up to now is we're going to be running the wires in, because we're going to have downlights the whole way across the building, and me and Phil have measured the length of the roof and we've divided by the amount of downlights we're going to have, and we're going to start running the cables in. I think Phil's behind me, isn't he? Yeah.
I've noticed that Brad likes to use the word we a lot, even though it was definitely me again. So like Brad said, I made another plan, and remember, you always want to write this down and store it, because once this stuff's covered, it's very hard to guess where it is. All of the first fixed cables have been installed. It's now time to install some audio cables. So this is some speaker cable. So we're having speakers in the ceiling. So it's very important when you're doing your build to note what you want. So if you're having audio, now's the time. TVs, make sure you've got power. So just remember to do all of that at this stage. Another thing to note when you're pulling in any sort of audio, so visual or speakers like we're doing here, I'm drilling a new set of holes. So you don't want to be feeding these through with your power cables, because one, you never know what might happen. You don't want to send 240 through this. And two, you'll get interference from this power cable, so you might get noise through your speakers and stuff. So just a little second hole and run it all separate. Okay. We sat there with Matt and Hannah and went through how many speakers they thought they'd want. So we opted for 4 inside, and we also went for another 4 outside. So you may notice that the cable colour changes. I wanted to lie and tell you that was so we could identify the outside speakers, but the truth is we just run out of the clear stuff, and that's all we could purchase from the shop. But it worked out a treat, because now we know what colour are for the outside speakers.
That is the audio complete. Now it's time to insulate. Look at me, I'm doing something.
What he really meant is, oh everyone, look at me, I'm doing something very badly. Because it wasn't a good job, was it? Once Brad had finished pretending that he actually does any work, I got on with cutting down all of the insulation for inside. So I opted to use the table saw. I've never done it before, but it actually sped the process up by miles, and I'd recommend it.
265.
Okay. When we was laying out our studs, we made sure that they were laid out with precision, and the reason is we was able to cut 95% of our insulation to 355, which is basically the gap you'll get on a 400 centre, and then we just had a few smaller cuts where the joins are, and then we could start putting in our wall insulation. And I'm pretty sure this whole process took no more than 30-40 minutes. So that table saw really did save us some time. And another thing that saved us time was, remember at the beginning of the build when I spoke about setting in our noggins at 1200 to the bottom? Well, insulation boards are 1200 by 2400. So that meant we only had to cut them off the ends and they slotted straight in. So it saved on a lot of cutting. On our insulation that we've already installed, you may have noticed some small gaps. So you might get some little gaps here or there. You don't want to be leaving those because everything needs to be fully insulated. So grab yourself some expanding foam, and if you come hither, we just need to fill those gaps like this. And I also recommend getting a proper gun because the can stuff is not the best. I then got on with filling any of those small gaps before moving on to insulating the rest of the walls, which went super quick. And remember, don't leave any of those cables behind. Make sure you bring them through that insulation, because once this is plasterboarded, you'll never find them.
That's the walls complete. Now it's time to move on to insulating our roof.
When it comes to insulating the roof, it's actually slightly different insulation. So we used 50mm PIR boards on the walls, which left us a 50mm gap on the back of the walls for ventilation. But on the roof, we use 100mm. We have 150mm worth of space, but we need to allow ventilation on that roof because it's a warm deck. So with the 100mm set flush to the bottom, we've still got a large enough space to vent that roof. Another little thing we do is wherever we're having speakers or lights, we actually take a big section out and then reinstall a thinner section of insulation. So we do lose some value on that, but in the end it's better because when the electrician comes, they're only going to dig it all out. So it's better to have this nice sealed pocket than a rough bit that's been dug out by the electrician. Well, that's my opinion on it anyway. Just remember, when you are installing insulation, especially the PIR boards, you need to have a mask. So ignore what me and Brad are doing, because this stuff is nasty and it makes your throat hurt and your eyes hurt. So just make sure you've got goggles and a mask on. Do as I say, not as I do. We're being bad influencers here.
Kev, what was that?
Kev wasn't saying a lot, but by his face, I'm sure he approved. We soon kicked him off of the site because of health and safety, and I'm not even sure how he got in there, before moving on with the rest of that ceiling. Another thing you'll note we're doing here, we're foil taping all of the joins, and that's because we're creating a vapor barrier. It then got dark and we started to panic because we was running out of time. That is all the insulation complete. We've got a couple of small jobs to quickly do now, and then we can move on to plasterboarding. And one of those small jobs is to put some small bits of batten across the front of our flitch beam. The only reason we have to do this is because the flitch beams aren't as thick as our walls, so we build them out, so when we plasterboard, everything's nice and flat. Now that that's all done, we can move on to our vapor barrier. So this is a vapor barrier, it's just basically some plastic sheet. And we're going to be putting that on all of our walls, and you can also do your ceiling, but instead of that, we've used foil tape. So now that acts as a vapor barrier, so we don't need to do the top. With a vapor barrier, it can get kind of messy. So the way we've figured is the easiest and the least amount of mess is to have two here. One rolls it around the room and the other holds it in the corners. You then drop it on the floor and cut it to size, and then you can go back to the beginning with it just laid around the edge. And then we basically start at the top, keeping it nice and tight just to keep it neat. And we use a stapler and staple it nice and tight and neat all around the top. And then we can start letting all of our cables through. So we just slice that and let it through, before then stapling down the rest of the wall and cutting off the excess on the bottom. The whole purpose of a vapor barrier is not actually to stop the vapors, but to control them. So when you're in a room and it's nice and hot and it's cold outside, you can get sweating in between your insulation and that board. So putting this up controls everything and prevents mold in the future. That is the vapor barrier installed. Now we can move on to plasterboarding. So we like to start with our ceilings, but before we do that, we need to go round and tuck all of our cables up into those little pockets that we created. This may seem like a pretty basic thing to do, but if you didn't do it, when you push up your plasterboard, it's so easy to trap cables and you won't be able to get them back out once this plasterboard's screwed up. So once they're all out of the way, we mark all of our roof joists onto the walls so that we can see where they are when we come to screwing on our plasterboard. And then it's time to start getting in our plasterboard. So we're using 9.5mm on our ceilings. These are full sheets. You can get smaller sheets if you're doing it by yourself and you're struggling, but we like to get full sheets. It's a lot easier to cover the whole ceiling that way. So we take our measurements, cut it down using a knife, and then you just snap it and cut the backing paper, and you're ready to install your cuts. You may have noticed that the drill I'm using, that's not any old drill, that is a drywall gun or a plasterboard gun. So basically it takes collated screws that are on a strip and you can just press it into position and it already sets the depth. I highly recommend them. They save so much time when you're screwing up a lot of plasterboard.
See these poles we're using, guys? They're making our life so much easier doing this ceiling. And if you want a set, the link is in the description below. Phil, how much easier do they make your life?
Oh, no easier at all. I'd never use them again. I know, I'm a really good liar. Clearly, I absolutely love them. They made our life so much easier. Another thing to know, always stagger your joints when you're doing plasterboarding. It's a lot less likely to crack.
My neck can't take any more of this.
That's how I'm going to drink my beer. One pint, please, mate. Oh, it's really coming together now.
Oh, the final piece to the puzzle, Billy.
Thank the Lord mighty Jesus.
Billy, you want help? Billy?
Oh, now you want to help. Once Brad had got out of my way, after pretending that he actually wanted to help someone, I get on with measuring for the height of our plasterboard on our walls. And I also marked out for all of our studs on the floor, just like I did with those roof joists. So I cut them all down using my skill saw. I definitely don't recommend that, but that's just what I wanted to do on the day to save a bit of time, and we could start installing those full boards before going back and cutting all of the smaller pieces down. Quick tip for when you're putting in your plasterboard, make sure they're not on the floor. So just remember, we've got skirtings coming around this building, so we've just chucked them up 30-40mm just to get them away from any moisture that might go on the floor and track up and ruin your plasterboard. When you're doing these walls, we're actually bringing the cables through, so unlike the ceiling where we've left them tucked out of the way, we need to bring all of our cables through these ones. So make sure when you are pulling them through that all of the slack is through. It's easy to pull a bit through and then trap cable behind. We're also only screwing the edge of the boards. The reason for that is, 1, we was running out of screws, and 2, we was running out of time. So we was in a rush. So we thought, screw the edge of the boards, get them on, make sure we don't run out of screws, and then we'll just finish it before the plasterer turns up. But that didn't happen how we wanted it to happen.
Oh, thank God Chris is here. Chris, you got to help us. Chris has just rolled up to help us get this thing boarded. I did promise I was going to get it boarded for him. Yeah, 9 o'clock last night. I sent him a video saying please help us. So Chris has turned up to help us.
Get a little boarded.
So if anyone wants plastering or rendering, hit your man up.
So once Brad had cut Chris off super rudely, they got in there and saved us, because as you can see, we failed to get that job finished. But luckily, the boys were on it and absolutely smashed that job out in no time. And while they was finishing the job we should have finished, I got on with cutting out our boxes. So we're using plasterboard boxes, so I mark them out using a level, and then we can slot them in, pull the clips through and pull our cables in. And if you're not watching this from the UK, It may look like I'm setting that switch kind of low, but over here we have regulations that it's no more than 1200 to the top. And like the switches, the sockets need to be no lower than 450.
We've got the boarding done, now it's time to get the beads on.
So what Chris has in his hand there is a plastering bead. These get installed on all external corners. So they use a stapler to fix it into position, making sure they're level and they are plumb wherever they're installed.
Scrimming the corners up now, and then get ready to put the stop bead on over the top.
So the scrim is basically a reinforcing mesh, and it's going to prevent any joins or any corners from cracking. Once that's on, he installs a stop bead, which is like the 90-degree bead that we used, except it can be used to stop plaster or for corners that ain't quite 90 degrees, like our bathroom. He then goes over all of the joins in the rest of the plasterboard, making sure it covers any of those gaps, because we don't want any cracking in the future. Including the joins, we also need to do those internals. So we want scrim basically everywhere, including the little tiny reveals. Once all the scrim's on, they get on with protecting the frames. You don't have to do this, but it's a lot nicer, so you haven't got as much cleaning and less risk of scratching those lovely black aluminium windows and doors that we installed. With the prep complete, it's finally time to start mixing up some plaster.
It's quite a warm day today, and this is quite a big ceiling to get on in one, so these lads are going to have a challenge ahead of them.
But they're not worried, they're professionals, so with their plaster all mixed up, they attack that big old ceiling. They start off by covering up all of the scrim tape, and then they go around the edges before starting to fill it all in. So they work together, one's on one end, one's on the other, and all they're basically doing here is just trying to get it on the wall. They're not too worried about it being flat, because that comes next. They're just trying to get enough on the wall ready to flatten it off. With the ceiling on, they then start attacking some of the walls. So they go for the big wall, which was kind of brave because it's quite a lot to cover in the heat that we had, but they had it covered. Not only did they do the ceiling and the big wall, they also did the reveals and a small wall on that shower room. Once the material was on and it started to set, it was time to flatten off that first coat.
How am I doing?
Not bad.
So what's the motion? From down, up, down?
Yeah, so go left, if you're right-handed, left to right.
What about when you're coming off a corner like this?
Yeah, you don't need to come up far. Just pull in a bit and then come down.
Sort of like that?
Yeah. Start from the top. That's it, pressure slowly.
All the way?
Slowly, go on, keep going. That's it, then pull up. That's it.
Spot on.
Spot on. I don't know what he's complaining about. Easy peasy. Right.
Chris soon took the trail back because apparently I was too fast and they wouldn't be able to keep up with me, before starting to get on their second coat on those sections that they had already done. And once that starts to set, it's then time to start smoothing off. So when I spoke to Chris, he basically said you can do up to sort of 6 or 7 runs after it's set. It just depends how easy it is to work with on the day.
I just want to cover why they've picked certain walls and haven't just done everything. It all comes down to experience. So they need to make sure what they put on the wall, they've got time to trail it up before it dries. So we're going to get out of their way so they can start getting on the rest of the walls.
Before the first walls had set too much and it was still a bit soft, they cleaned out any of the boxes, because plaster will always get in there a little bit. So that's the perfect time to start clearing out. And it was time to start moving on to the rest of this building. So we've got 2 walls inside that shower room that you can't see. We're leaving the other 2 and you'll see why later on. But for now, that's all they needed to do. And before this all sets, they pull off the little run of scrim that they put on the bottom. And as someone that's going to be fitting the skirtings, that is going to be awesome because it leaves a perfectly flat bottom. And they also remove all of the protective tape that was on the windows. And then they could get tidied up because the sun was starting to set on another day on this build.
To install the roof, it needs to be completely dry, and as you can see, our one's not.
And to speed the process up, Brad jumped up with a broom and a large squeegee and removed most of the excess.
While the roof is drying, we are now going to move on to the fascias and the soffits. So that's the bit that goes on this little overhang. And we're going to start with the soffit, the bit that goes underneath. And to install that, we need to put on some J trims.
So a J trim is basically a starter for the soffit. So you could slide your soffit up into that little groove that it's got. And to install it, we line it up with our roof joists and send through some 30mm screws.
What you've just seen me do there is cut back one of our J trims so that it lands halfway on one of our roof joists, because obviously you don't want them dangling in the middle of nowhere.
We get on with installing the rest of our J trim. This you can do by yourself, so I'm just literally holding it on one end, getting some fixings in and working my way from left to right. And then to cut it down for any pieces, I'm literally just using my multi-tool.
I'm going to bring you up here with me just to show you. I've got my speaker cable coming from the back end of my trim, but for the lights, we're actually leaving them up over the top. So if you have got speakers, remember that, because these are going on our posts.
Obviously, that only really applies if you're having outside speakers like we are. With the cables all in the correct positions, I work my way around the whole perimeter of this building installing those J trims.
That is all of our J trim installed on the whole building. We can now start putting in our soffit.
With soffits, you order them in set sizes. So these ones are 350mm wide, so we need to cut them down. We've never really tried the table saw, but we thought we'd give it a go on this job, and it worked out perfectly. It was very clean cuts. And just remember, when you're cutting these down, we don't want the exact size. We want them to be a bit short, because obviously they're going to expand and contract, especially this black color. So with the size cut down, we start to install them, and the way you do that is to slide it into that J trim. And I'm not going to pretend that's not a fiddly job. So me and Brad struggle, and once it goes in, it's easy from there. All you need to do is add some screws to the front, because eventually the fascia is going to hold the rest of it up. When we are installing this soffit, just remember we are 5mm short from the back of that J trim, so we're not pushing it all the way in. And that's going to be the space that allows it to expand when the temperature changes.
Soffits, we have completed them. It's now time to move on to our fascias. So we actually prep those down here on the floor, and then we'll take them up onto the roof.
The way I prepare these is to mark 100mm from the edges of our full lengths and put in 2 of our black polytop nails. I'm only literally going through the surface so they hold themselves, and then I space them using my hammer. And then using that square, I put one at 50mm and 140mm from that bottom edge. The reason I do that is because that's where I'm going to have solid fixings. So it may look like I've left a big gap at the top, but remember, we're going to be cutting these down, because just like the soffits, these are oversized.
So we did want to get this roof on yesterday, but somebody, not me, didn't order enough polytop nails. So we've had to go out. Phil, look how angry he's angry about that. It was definitely me, but we've got some this morning. The only problem we've got is rain's forecast in about 2.5 hours. In that 2.5 hours, we've got to get the fascias on, cut them all down, glue the roof down before the rain comes.
What a surprise, we're fighting the British weather again. First job was to get all of our temporary fixings removed from that rubber roof. Right, so we're just going to pull the roof out the way so we can get the fascias on. We decided the safest method for us with that weather hovering over was to remove half, do half of the fascias, and then do the other half after, so we can keep this roof at least half protected just in case the rain started to come. So to install our fascias, we slide them up onto the roof and we work from the top. So we lean it over, pull it up tight to our soffit balls, and then get our nails in.
When we're installing these, just remember you need to pull the fascia tight, because that's what's going to essentially hold that soffit that we installed yesterday. So we pull it up tight and put your nails in.
You may have noticed that the protection is still on. So when I'm putting in my nails, I'm not actually sending them all the way through. I'm leaving them proud. Then I remove the protection. And once that's done, we can send the nails all the way in. But don't overdo it. They only need to be snug.
I do want to say one thing. Every time it rains here, look who's here. Every time. Jimmy. Jimmy brings rain, I'm sure of it.
And that's not superstition, that's just pure facts.
On the corners, so on one of them, you need to cut this little bottom section out because it overlaps the one before. So we literally just cut this little corner out so they can sort of overlap.
To remove it, we use the multi-tool. Once again, that tool is super handy when you're doing a job like this. With that corner removed, we can start nailing on the rest of our fascias. So just remember, like I said before, we're not putting them all the way in before removing that protection, because if you do forget, it is a nightmare to get that protection from behind the heads of those poly tops. When it comes to our joins, we don't actually pre-nail those. We cut them while we're up on the roof, and then we put the nails in up there so we can make sure the spacings look correct. Remove the protection, get that nailed in, and that is all of our fascias on to our building. Once they're on though, we need to trim them down. So some people trim these while they're down and bring them up fully cut, but because we've got this sloping roof, we find we get a better finish if we just run the multi-tool round while we're up top. And while I was doing it with the multi-tool, Brad thought he could save some time by using a handsaw. And I can assure you that was not the case, but good for him for getting involved. So with the first half done, we get our rubber pulled back over and it's time to do the second half, removing those trims that were holding it temporarily and installing it just as we did the first half.
Jim just waved us down and said, "It's not looking good, Breath." And I agree, it is not looking good. So, speed!
So with the weather closing in, I have to agree with Jeremy Clarkson on this one. Speed was definitely key.
What we're doing now is we're rolling with a little pole half of the roof back, ready to glue, because this is a wet lay, so we're going to glue half and then we'll literally roll this straight back out.
Before we do any gluing, we get out our big leaf blower once again to make sure there is nothing on that roof, because that's one of the most important things. We don't want any bits getting underneath our rubber. So with it completely clean, we start rolling out in strips, and as we do, we roll out that rubber that we put on that plastic tube.
So we've got all that side glued now. Phil is grabbing. Oh, you fucking shit. So now we've got stumbling my fucking one. He's slowly working his way out the corners like this. And then we're going to push all the air bubbles this way.
Once Brad had finished showing us the worst cha-cha slide I've ever seen, I got on with pushing out all of the air bubbles. Something I have missed is we are leaving 100mm space around the perimeter of our roof when we're rolling out that glue. And I'm going to explain why in a little while. So we get the main glue rolled out, making sure it's evenly covered, and then roll out the last of our EPDM, or as most people know it, rubber roof.
And now you can see why we left that 100mm back on the edge, because we need to do this double stick adhesive and that's just going to stop the edges from ever peeling or bubbling, because they're prone to it, especially on a big roof like this.
Another thing to mention about this, everything I'm using was supplied by Rubber for Roofs. So this is an actual installation kit. So that small foam roller, the double stick, the glue, the big rollers, everything is included when you get the fitting kit, making this type of roof super easy.
And while Phil's gluing that out, I just want to do a massive shout out to Rubber for Roofs for supplying this roof in this video. Also, they've been kind enough to give you guys at home a discount for one of these. Link is in the description below.
Ooh, who doesn't love a discount? Thanks, Brad. You can now get out of the way and let the grown-ups do the rest of the work. So I'll get on with rolling out that 100mm strip, leave it to tack off for about 15 minutes. And then once it's gone tacky, we push it down, and I can assure you that edge is never lifting.
Breaking news, it's now raining in the UK, which is very unusual. However, we've got work to do, so we're going to carry on. Before we start installing any of the trims, now that we're at this stage, on the gutter side, so this is where our gutter's going, we need to install some battens, and that's going to step off our roof so we can get all of the water away.
That probably wasn't the best description of what it does. What it actually does is allow the water to travel past the fascias and then into our gutter, so it creates a lip. So I'm not sure why I said allows the water to get away.
That's the batten across the back finished. Next step, we need to cut the rubber on these three sides, not the gutter side, and we need to cut it down so there's only a 50mm lap sitting over the edge. So we're going to cut all these three edges and we can finally move on to those trims.
The 50mm lap, when I cut it, I just sort of eyeball it. It hasn't got to be exact, it just needs to be near enough 50mm. But if you are worried, you can measure and mark it out.
Oh, it's really coming together now. That is it all trimmed down. Remember, only on the three edges because the gutter one is different. So now we're going to install our upstands. So that's one of the upstand trims that comes with these roofs.
So like the rest of the kit, we haven't had to work any of this out. We've just sent the size of the roof and then everything is supplied as you need it.
Oh, and don't forget to pull the protective film off. I don't know why I didn't do that. I'm recreating Matilda.
I'm not sure if that was funny or creepy.
When it comes to any little cuts that ain't full length, all we do, all I do, line it up with our edge, and then I just mark back 10mm because we want room for this to expand and contract. And I'll just grab my multi-tool and cut it off.
And just like the rest of our fascias and soffits, we need to remember to remove that protection before sending those poly top nails all the way in. And these trims are supplied with their very own poly tops from Rubber for Roofs.
So on these trims, you need to put some corners on. So this is a corner, and because it's going on two upstands, we need to break out these little tabs. So I'll just use my hammer and just twist them like that. And then make sure we get the plastic off the roof because that's just terrible. And then all we do is we slide them over, and we're going to be using a poly top to go through, but I only do one side so it allows for a bit of expansion between the two.
I also try to line up those nails with the rest so that it doesn't look completely out of place.
And on the straight joins, so these gaps here, we've got these straight connectors. So with these, we hook the bottom first, and then you just sort of push them up and over, and that is the straights covered. Next up is the gutter trims. The weather's fantastic, so we're going to crack on like we normally do. So on the gutters, it's a two-part system. So this one here gets nailed onto the batten that we installed. The rubber then comes over, and then we install this one over the top. So we'll get these all on first and then we'll move on to the ones that go on the top.
And don't think I haven't seen Brad squeegeeing in the rain, which is basically like taking a bucket to the ocean and trying to empty it. But he was just trying to keep that back edge a little bit dry because that's where I was kneeling and that's where all the water was heading.
Now we're going to push this one over the top nice and tight. So I sort of roll it in. Just make sure your roof sits tight. And then we're going to nail through both.
On that first trim, we've used headless nails because it needs to be super smooth. But on this top trim, we're using the poly tops they supplied. And I'm also stretching that rubber as I put each nail in, and it's just going to prevent any bubbling right on that edge. Not that it's a major problem anyway.
Just remember to like and subscribe so me and Phil can just keep getting drenched for you guys. We love it, really.
Really hot.
It's really coming together now.
With the sun absolutely beaming down on us, I get on the last of our trims, doing a little pig's ear detail with that rubber underneath and then putting on the last of the corners. But with the corner that meets the gutter, just remember you're only removing one of those blanking plates and the one on the gutter we leave in.
It's another day, the weather has passed. I mean, I wouldn't call it shorts and t-shirts weather, but at least it's dry. So now we can move on to installing the trims that we didn't do when we did our fascias and soffits.
Normally, this is something you'd do when you install the fascias and soffits, but as you could see in the video, we was constantly fighting the weather. So it was more important for us to get that roof on and come back to the trims after, which isn't a big deal. We just slip them up underneath those upstands that we installed for the EPDM. So there's two types of trims we're going to be using. There's this one here that's like a double L on both sides. One can go on the fascia straight joins and the other can do the soffits. So we just chop off that little L section and then use some super fast on one side to attach it.
Our corners are the same thing, it's just a slightly different trim. So as you can see, it's like a pre-formed corner.
Just like the other trim, I used my multi-tool to cut it down. I've left them all slightly long just so I can tuck that cut up underneath the trim that's above.
Time to install our guttering, and our first job is to get a set of these clips, and we're going to screw one in that end, screw one in that end, and then we're going to pull a string line.
The way I install my clips is to set the first as high as I can get it to that batten that we installed a bit earlier on, and then I set the last one as low as I can possibly get it on our fascia board, and then I just grab a chalk line and pull it across the two clips and use that as a guide for the rest. And I set my clips 1 meter apart on half round gutter like we're installing on this job.
Now that we've installed the end cap, we're going to lay the drain pipe out. So we're going to lay it out, and then we're going to actually add an extra clip to pick this joining strip up that we're adding into it.
I think Brad's been working up north a little bit too long because he doesn't say up anymore, he says up. So we get on with clipping in our gutter. The way you do that is just to slide it under and clip them in. And remember, we've put those extra clips near our joins just to give it that little bit extra support. And then a cap on the last end, and obviously our downspout. And that is the EPDM fascias, soffits and all the trims complete. And I think it looks fantastic just the way it is.
That is the roof complete, finally. And if you looked at our thumbnail, you would have seen something a little bit different with that roof. And that is because their house is very high up and this roof is very low down. So if you follow me, we hit up MGN, who is our local building merchants, and we've got some artificial grass.
So before we do anything, let's get all 3 rolls up on the roof.
Right, that's all 3 rolls up here. We're now going to start with our first roll on the far side and get it all lined up, ready to go.
So no, our picture was not clickbait. We really are putting some artificial grass on the roof of this building. And at the end you're going to see, I think it was really worth the effort we put into it because it has transformed the look from up at the house. So we start by pre-trimming one edge and lining it up with our trims, and then I'll trim the second edge in, ready to be installed. One slip and the roof is leaking, little one slip and the roof is leaking. Yes, I have copyrighted that song, and I know I have the voice of an angel. So we get on with trimming the rest of this grass and lining it up with those upstands. And what you're seeing me do here is cutting the strip that's going to be joining onto the next. With everything trimmed down, we pull back half, ready to start attaching it to that EPDM. To stick this down, we're going to be using some green. So this is dark green, CT1, so it doesn't really matter if it's wet or not. And our first bead is going to be 50mm away from our trim. With these beads, we're being super generous because the bottom of artificial turf isn't the smoothest surface, so we want to make sure we've got full contact. Once we've done that first bead, we set the rest at about 400 to 500mm apart, and we're doing straight lines towards that gutter because any moisture that gets through, we don't want it getting trapped. Most of the water will get through this because the type of artificial that we're using is perforated. It's meant to allow water through. We then tuck the rest of the artificial underneath the trims that we installed. So lucky for us, these upstands have got like a little lip underneath. So you can tuck that artificial under and it leaves a perfect finish. And another thing it does is going to prevent any wind getting underneath and uplifting it. So with the first one done, we get on to the next, doing the exact same thing, gluing it down in strips, making sure that we're very liberal with our adhesive. But I do leave about 150mm gap on the far edge where we're going to be joining them. And you'll see why in a little while. All of a sudden, we've sped up because in typical English nature, look at that that's just come over our head. With the weather once again overhead, we turn up our speed. And remember that join I left the space for? This is why. I like to do a little zigzag pattern through this to help join the two pieces together. And I've also done a particular cut on this. I've cut one side allowing excess on the back lines, and then I've cut the other tight to the tuff. So when you line them up, it gives you the best join that you're going to get. Now, it won't be invisible at the beginning because they never are, but as time goes on, they blend and they start to disappear. On the gutter side, we're going to be using polytop nails, pulling it over and nailing about 100mm down into that gutter. The reason we do that is because it's an open edge and we don't want the wind getting underneath. So if we fold it over and nail it with those polytops, we've got a lot less chance of the wind grabbing it and ripping it off the roof, which nobody wants. With the last piece, we line it up with our gutter, allowing about 50mm, and then we trim it roughly down to size before doing our join and getting half of it glued. Right, what I'm doing now with the join, I'm just pushing it all into that adhesive, and then every now and again I'll just give it a little pull just to make sure that gap is tight. And now you'll see what we've done. So that was the one with the big lip that we left, and this one's got nothing. So that, when they're pulled together, that tuff sits over that. Wow. You don't end up with a really thick line through the middle. And then once you give it some of this beans, should start to disappear. I carried on giving the joint a lovely back scratch until it was all blended in, and then I moved on to trimming in the last of those edges, and then we use our carpet bolster to tuck the last of that edges, which is going to lock it in and give it a perfect finish. One more step before we jump down off the roof, and that is to sweep all of the pile up. So if you look at it now, it's all flat where it's been rolled. Grab yourself a stiff broom, and we're just going to pull the pile of the artificial up in the air. It just makes it look a lot more natural. They do sell tools for lifting the pile up on artificial, but because it's a roof, we just grabbed a couple of stiff brooms, swept it up, and that is plenty for what this is going to be doing. That's the roof complete. I'm going to go downstairs and take a look at the bathroom.
It's now time to get on with our shower room. The first job is going to be first fixing our plumbing, but we are not going to be doing that. Mr. Mark Tiff is going to be doing that.
So this is our shower tray. We're going to be putting this into position in the shower room and seeing exactly where our waste pipes are going to go.
So like Mark, this is the first time we've seen this type of setup on a tray, and it's all from Easy Bathrooms. We was a bit dubious at the beginning, but once we started to assemble it, we think it's actually a quality little bit of kit. So before we assemble it, we get it put into position with some plasterboard offcuts just to set where it'll actually be sitting and mark out for our trap. With that done, we can remove it again and start to put on all of the feet that come in the kit. So we've got the clips that are going to be holding our plimps, and then we've got the feet themselves. So these get screwed into the correct position. We clean all of the bottom off with some multi-sol from C-Tech just to remove any dust, and then we can apply some PGB, some power grab and bond, and that's what's going to be holding those feet in position. Once the glue's on with this stuff, you should let it sit for about 5 minutes to 10 minutes. Give it a little twist, and that is enough to hold them in position until they fully set.
The tray is now prepped and ready to go in, but before we do finally put that in, obviously we need to run our pipe work. So we've marked our trap, like you see earlier. Now we've set up a laser so we know where that is parallel to our tray, and we're going to drill straight through with a core hole saw.
I sounded super enthusiastic when I said it there, but Tiff had forgot his proper core drill, and we had to use my little DeWalt SDS. And after taking many turns, we barely managed to cut one hole.
It's really easy. We've got 2 more holes to drill, but that drill is just not strong enough. Tiff's going to bring a bigger drill tomorrow, so we're not going to sit around and do nothing. We're going to install the cold feeds.
Brad throwing around that word we again. What he meant was Tiff or Mark was going to do all of the rest of the work. So what he started to do was set up a laser and drill through for all of his cold feeds. So in this build there isn't any hot feeds because there's no boiler. This is all going to be electric. So we've got an electric shower, and we've also got a small electric heater for the basin. So we've got 2 cold feeds coming into this building because you can't bend around that solid corner. And he's also using plastic at our request. So Tiff likes to use copper, but because we didn't want to notch any of these timbers due to the weight that sat on them, remembering we've got all those stills on the roof, we asked him to do it in plastic because plastic can be fed into the voids a lot easier. So we get set up for our shower, our basin, and obviously the cold feed for our toilet.
So we need to get water and electric to our building, and how we're going to do that, we're going to dig a trench 180 metres away from there using that digger.
And along with that digger, we reached out to a company called Rhinox because they've got this attachment that is specifically for trenches. And I have to say, without this attachment, I would still be digging that trench to this day. Because the trench is filled with rocks. Everywhere you dig here is just rock. So before we dug anything, I sent Brad on his merry way with the CAT scan to check for any cables or pipes.
We're clear to dig.
With Usain Bolt out of my way, I get on with digging the trench that's going to be taking both of the services, the water and the electric. So the trench needs to go down to 750 millimeters. The deepness is for the water, so the water's going to go at the bottom. We're then going to backfill it ever so slightly for the electric at 450.
So we're doing something a little bit different with this shower. We're not having a big unit on the wall. We're having a touch panel which links up to this unit on the wall.
And what that unit is an electric shower, but unlike the traditional ones that you normally have inside of the shower itself, this one gets mounted elsewhere. So I've never been a fan of electric showers because I just think they look a little bit unsightly. But with this one, we can hide it in a cupboard, out of the way, and all that you've got inside of your shower now is a really nice touchpad and the shower head. So Tiff gets on with plumbing it in. We've got our cold feed and then obviously our hot coming out towards the shower. And also we've got a nice big 10mm cable that's going to be supplying it, because this is 9.5 kilowatts.
This is one of the most important bits when you come to set in the shower. You've got to get that back plate in the right position, because you've got to allow for plasterboard and tile, and that bit has got to be spot on.
Just remember guys, Mark has installed that, so if it all goes pear-shaped at the end and it's sticking too far out, it wasn't my fault, it was definitely Mark's fault. So fingers crossed it fits as it should.
Right, we're now about to core drill the hole out for the toilet. I'm going to use 150mm core bit, because this allows us to get that actual end bit of the fitting sunk into the wall outside.
Unlike the small SDS we was using last time, this big core drill made absolute light work of all of the core holes we needed. So we had 3 in total. We had a 4-inch for the toilet, which you can see him sliding in now, and we also had 2 smaller ones, one for the basin and one for the shower. So with them all set up, we are now fully prepped and ready to re-insulate them walls and get our plasterboard reinstalled. Just remember, when you are installing the plasterboard after doing all your pipe work, take note of where all of the pipe work is, because you don't want to be putting screws into any of that pipe work at this stage, because you'll have to remove everything and redo it.
The walls are all boarded, now it's time to get our tray in.
Because Mark had previously installed all of the feet, all that was left to do was to adjust them using a level to make sure everything was perfect before we attach it to the walls.
So what I'm doing here is making sure this protective film is pulled off the back of the tray. Loads of people forget to do it, and that is when water can get in the back.
As well as the back, we also need to remove the protection for where the trap's going. And then using some BT1, which is basically bathroom grade silicone from C-Tech, we do a line on the wall and stick it, and then we also do a second line on top. So that's just going to give us 2 barriers of protection if any water's to get behind. We also use the BT1 in the joins on the plasterboard, which may seem a bit odd, but you'll see why a little bit later on. We're now at the top of where we're going to be digging our trench, because this is the water supply we're going to be connecting on. This is an old trough, it's no longer needed, so we're going to use that water supply and that stop clock to connect on, so we've got power down at the bottom. So let's get digging our trench. Not sure why I said power when all we're pulling in is water, but anyway, we started to get on with it.
Looks like we ain't digging there then. This is why it's always good to grab a CAT scan, because there's actually something under there, so we're just going to quickly reroute it round the outside to make sure that we don't hit anything.
I didn't like that route anyway. So with our new route selected, we rescanned, and then it was time to start digging. We only actually dug a small section so that we could get the joint made where we're taking the water from, which is where that trough is. The reason we're doing that is because this field needs to be accessed, so we can't have it open for too long, and we wasn't ready to dig the whole trench yet. So we got our man Mark Tiff in to connect up the water, and then using the digger I carefully removed the old trough without spilling a drop of water, as you can see. With that out of the way, we hand dug the last section because we didn't want to risk damaging anything else underneath the floor with the digger. Fed that little section of pipe in, and then we backfilled that entrance, because remember, this thing's used for access, so we can't have it open. So I backfill it, roll the digger over just to compact it a little bit, and then we can get on with digging the rest of our trench. Now we're going to get our blue water pipe pulled in to our trench. When I said that, I thought it was going to be easy, but rolling 100 meters worth of blue pipe was actually a bit of a pain. What I don't want to do is fall in here, that's for sure. It's very deep at the moment. It really was. 750mm deep to be precise.
Great success. Let's go and get this pulled into the trench.
As you can hear by my voice, I was super excited to do another lap of that trench. So with the pipe all pulled in, I used the digger to half backfill that trench up to 450mm, and it was time to jump back inside.
The room is prepped, ready for our tiling, but you remember we got Dan in to do our double glazing? Well, we've now got Dan back.
There he is.
And now he's going to be doing our tiling. So now we can call this the DB show.
Before we do any tiling, we need to tank our walls, and we're going to be using BW1.
With Dan's best Blue Peter impression out of the way, let me explain exactly what BW1 is. So this is a tanking system unlike any other, because as you can see, we're painting directly onto unprepped plasterboard. So this system has been created to make everything super easy. So the only prep work we have to do with this system is to use BT1 in the joints directly in the shower, as you can see that white silicone there. And then we're going to be painting this system in 2 directions. So the first coat we're going to go up and down. And when I say where, I mean Dan is, because I'm not doing it. And then once that starts to set, we need to do a second coat going the opposite direction. So we're going across. It's really that simple. No tape, no nothing. So we really like that system. And I'm not sure about the face that Dan just pulled. So Dan gets on, making sure we've got full coverage. And then we can get the protection we put on the tray off. And that is the room ready for tiling.
The tanking has dried, but before we move on to our tiling, Second City Screed are actually back to grind this floor.
So you may remember these guys from when they did the flow screed. They're now back to remove the latents off the top. So that's just something that comes out of flow screed, and you need to remove it because you won't be able to adhere anything to it. And because we're having LVT, we need this floor to be perfect. So although this machine looks super aggressive, it actually only removes about 1 millimeter of product off the top, and then it leaves a nice dull flat finish at the end. So the guys get on, making sure to clean up all of the dust behind them, and that is the floor prepped ready for latex or smoothing compound.
So the boys have got me back in to start all the tiling.
That's right, DB is back ready for a bit of tiling.
There is a pattern forming, Philip.
You're right, and that pattern is on anything that's hard to do. We get Dan to come back and do it for us.
What you've just seen us do is lay out all of the tiles. There's 3 different styles, as you can see from our piles. Oh, that rhymed. And then we've just mixed and matched them until we're happy with the design. Now they're laid out, we can start getting ready to cut and install.
So when it comes to tiling, it's all in the prep work. So our walls are nice and flat, our tanking's done, and now we've decided on the layout and we're marking out for our grout lines and also the top of that first row that we're going to be installing. So with that marked out, we get a laser set up, so that's going to help us get our tiles completely level when we come to installing them, and it also gives Dan something to measure from, so he can pre-cut all of the tiles ready to go in. Because we're going to be using something called rapid adhesive, we are not going to have time to put the adhesive on the wall and then cut the tiles after. So really, we want everything cut ready to go. So Dan gets on with cutting. He's using a wet saw here, and he's also using some buffing pads. That just takes any of the rough edges off the tiles and leaves a super smooth finish. When it comes to the pipe work, it's the same thing. We need to mark them out, and then we cut them all outside using a little 4-inch grinder, making sure all of our cuts are in the perfect position. With the smaller cuts, we just use diamond tipped hole saws.
So we've got 4 full tiles cut, and we're going to knock up some adhesive and get them on the wall.
Once we had checked that Dan hadn't had a stroke and he was just zoning out, we got on with applying our adhesive to the wall where our first 4 tiles are going to be going. So you may be asking, why are we only doing 4 tiles? Well, because they're large format and this adhesive is rapid, it's better just to mix up a small amount and that then gives us time to make sure everything is in the correct position and perfect. So with these large format tiles, we are using something called leveling clips, but even though we're using those, you still need to use a level to make sure that everything is completely flat. If you like the look of these tiles or anything in this shower room, go check out Easy Bathrooms. They have sponsored this segment, so big shout out to those guys, and the link will be in the description below.
Now that the floor has been ground to remove the latency, the guys have gone away and they've come back ready to install the smoothing compound.
Before we go in with the smoothing compound, we've got to check this floor is dry with this moisture meter.
I'm not sure who spiked Joe's drink with sugar, but I love it. His energy is just great.
Testing's done. Now it's time to go in with the primer.
Apart from the primer, one of the most important steps that you need to take when doing this job is to be wearing safety socks. So the socks that Joe is wearing, they may look like ordinary socks, but they're not. They offer high protection against risks you may face while on site. So Joe gets on with priming the room, and once that's done, it's allowed to dry and we can get on with the smoothing compound itself.
And now that it's gone off tacky, we're going to mix up some smoothing compound.
Wow, thanks Charlie. So that's exactly what they did. They got on with mixing up the smoothing compound.
Now that it's perfectly mixed, we're going to get this down.
While the lads were making the mixes, Joe got on with pouring them in. So this was all happening simultaneously. So Joe started to use his cam rake to move it about while the lads were mixing up the next batch, because you don't want any of the edges to dry. So Joe took off his safety socks and put himself on some fancy new footwear. These are called spiked shoes. They basically allow you to walk inside of that smoothing compound without getting it all over your shoes and all over the floor.
So what Joe's doing is gently pushing it into the corners and then pulling the cam rake away to get a nice even surface.
So a cam rake is literally what it says on the tin. It is a rake with cams on it. So it allows you to set that rake at a certain height off the floor underneath. So we've got 3mm, so we end up with a perfect thickness.
Just make sure when you're mixing up your smoothing compound that you mix it to the exact amount of water required for your one.
So like Brad said, when you are mixing this up, follow the instructions and make sure you put the amount of water that is specified on the brand that you pick. It's super important so you get that perfect finish.
So if anybody wants any liquid screed, underfloor heating or resin driveways, the link is in the description below.
Excuse me Joe, I think you'll find that's my part. But as you've done it already, I'll let it slide this one time.
We've got to get this big roller cable from here all the way to here.
Yep, it's time to go back to my favourite trench. So before we get to the trench itself, we need to cut open the entrance to the driveway and create a 450mm deep cavity to take the cable across to where it's going to be connected. So using the petrol cutter that we got from Speedy Hire, we cut 2 perfectly straight lines and then use a breaker to break that top layer of concrete out before getting the bucket that we got from Rhinox to dig the hole. I had a little break in between and then I got back to work.
As you can see people, we're digging down to 450. Deep down there is where we're going to be putting our cable. Phil operating the machinery over there.
Our plan is to tip this on his front somehow. It only weighs 425 kg. And then once it's up, we're going to roll out enough to get around the building that we're going to be taking our power from. And then with all that easy peasy bit out of the way, we're going to roll it down the field, hopefully.
First things first, we needed to get it on its side. So with that done, we start to push it towards the house because the plan was to unreel as much of that cable as we could, ready to pull it into that little chase we dug in the driveway. Problem was, the outside of the drum was bigger than the inside. So because we didn't stay in school, we didn't realise this when we made our plan. Every time we rolled it, the cable was getting pulled along with it. But we managed, and we start to get that cable pulled into position, which isn't as easy as it sounds.
Right, I'm pushing it.
Wait. Go back. Oh my God, digging nails. Oh. Oh. Every single bit of my leg. Oh. Gee.
Strange. I always thought it was a dock leaf you used on stinging nettles, but it turns out you just need a really big broom.
What, you're not to the corner yet?
Not to the far end, no.
Not great success.
Once I'd got over the excitement of this job, we got on with pulling through more cable to get to the corner of the building where we was connecting it, and then we could finally lay it into that chase that we created, and then we put some tape over. This may seem a bit pointless, but that can actually save someone when they're digging it up, because that's the first thing to come out. With that done, it's time to start rolling it down the hill, and as you can see, it just kept pulling the cable out constantly. After a little while, we took it down to the bottom field and just unreeled it by hand. Then we connected it to the digger because the cable was so light we didn't want to do it by hand, and then we pulled it all the way to the end of our trench. With the cable roughly in position, we parked the digger up and it was time for some manual labour. So we pull the cable into position, get back in the digger, and we can get it all backfilled, and that is that job complete.
Cable is in our big massive chase. We've put some marker tape over the top just to help someone if they ever dig it, you never know. And then we're going to put some shingle on top of that, and then we're going to backfill and re-concrete this chase.
So that's exactly what we did. We grabbed some bags of shingle. This is 10mm, as you can see in big white writing on the bag. We put that over just to cover over the top, and then we backfill it with some of that rubble that come out of it when we dug it, and then we left about 4 inches on top for a nice little bit of concrete.
Now that the water and electric is all running, it's time to install our weed membrane for our deck.
So this job is fairly easy. You literally just roll it out wherever you're going to be building the deck. But although it is easy, it is important because you don't want anything growing up in between your deck when you build it.
That's our membrane done. Now we can start with the framing for our deck.
So we're going to be using some 6x2 treated C24 timber. The reason I'm only using 6-inch timber on this deck is because the span is quite short. It's only actually about 2 meters wide. So because we're using composite deck, we're marking out at 300 centers, not your typical 400. So I'll mark everything on the bench and then I'll assemble it on the floor once it's all marked out. I just find it a lot easier to do it that way. With the first of the timbers marked out, we take it over to the chop saw and chop off anything that we need to shorten. So these are a set size, so we just shorten them down to what we need.
So that full length I marked out is going to go on the outside, and that cut piece will go against the building.
With our first parts ready to go, it's time to start assembling our frame. So to put it together, we're using 90mm framing nails, and they're also ring shanked, so it just stops them from coming out in the future. Now these are not the only fixings we're going to be using.
Now that this is built, we're going to get this in position and level using some temporary feet.
Because I do my posts after the frame's built, it's easier for us just to put it on some temporary bits of timber to hold it in position, ready for when we dig.
Oh my God.
Ideal, is it?
No, that's not ideal. So we get a few more fixings in our temporary feet, and it's time to move on to the second half of this corner. So the way I'm building this is to start on the corner. So we've got 2 matching sections that wrap around, and we're leaving the middle open, and you'll see why in a moment. So this is the way I do it. I find it easier to build in sections rather than trying to build the whole frame on the outside and then infill it all. It's just easier to do this, put some temporary feet on it and build it in sections. It also means the sections are light enough that 2 people can lift them into position and also bring it up to the height we need.
With this section built to this stage, I'm just going to check this corner with a building square just to make sure it's pretty close, because we can adjust it slightly when we put our permanent posts in, which, well, it's actually perfectly square, so that's lucky. So now that we know it's square, I'm going to get on with infilling this section here.
So the reason we left the center section empty is because we're having something called a breaker board, and we need to frame to take that. So it's always important to plan your deck frame ahead of time. So we're putting in a 45-degree ladder section, which you're seeing me build now, and that's going to pick up the breaker board, and it's also going to pick up the ends of the two decks. And just like the rest of the deck, this also needs to have some noggins inside of it at 300mm. You still need to support that breaker board like you would the rest. So we measure out for 300mm all the way through that center section and install noggins using our 90mm framing nails. And when it all comes together, you'll see why it's called a ladder section, because it literally resembles a ladder.
Now that that section's in, this will give us the actual exact measurements we need to infill the gaps.
And what he means by that is some angled cuts. So all of the pieces from here to the rest of the deck are going to have a 45-degree cut that meet that ladder. So I like to measure it out and have equal pieces both sides, so we start from the end and work our way back to that deck that we've already built. The way you do this is to measure that straight section at 300mm sections like everything else, and then cut your 45-degree and just make sure they're all sat completely square to the frame and at 45 degrees to that ladder section, and that is the little detail complete.
That's the intricate part of the deck complete. Now we're going to build some smaller sections to extend it.
There's a few reasons why I do this deck in sections. One, like I said before, it's easier to build them and move them into position, but also this adds extra strength to our deck. So this is only going to span 2 meters, and then when we add our little extra section that goes to our post, which you'll see in a bit, we've now got a board supporting through the middle. So it's a lot stronger than having spans of over 2 meters. So we get on with building the rest of the sections, call in all of the help that we can find to lift it into place, because I don't want to do any heavy lifting myself, and then we nail the two together before moving in that final section that spans to the posts that are actually holding the roof above. Add a little section so we can get through the gap, and that is the basic framing complete for our composite deck.
Me and Phil are split up into 2 teams today. He's going to be jumping on with the deck. Me and Dan are going to be getting on with the resin driveway. Our first task of today is getting the grano dust down, because the delivery driver wouldn't take it down for us. So me and Dan are going to have to use the digger.
We're going to try anyway.
They're not going to try, they're going to do it. I have every faith that that digger has got the muscle to get that bag down.
We don't have problems, we have solutions.
A bit of to-in and throw-in, and the bag was on the digger, and I can assure you it was at its maximum capacity, because it pretty much wheelied the whole way down the field. But it got the job done.
And that is how you do it. Before we can get any resin down, we've got to get this base prepared.
And it was nice for once for someone else to be in the digger and not me.
Right then, so what we're doing now is basically reducing the dig to allow us to have 150mm of sub base compacted and rolled, ready for a resin.
And Dan soon found that this wasn't no easy dig. This house seems to be built on some sort of quarry, because there's just rocks and boulders everywhere. But he got it done.
We're setting some lines to our finished levels of our edgings. Obviously we're not going to be level, but we're going to be flat and straight. We are following the ground level.
So before this job started, me and Dan had a little discussion about what was going to look best. And we decided that following the ground was going to make it tie in to the land around it. So that's what we did. So it's going to be flat, but it's not going to be level.
Now Dan's going around with his shovel. He's going to square it up just so we can get a nice clean edge with the curbs.
The curbs are going to be following the decking, and they're also going to be going along the edge where the land is. So we need to get all of that tidied up, even if it means getting out the shovel. With everything cleaned up, it's time to pull some lines to set the finish height of the resin and the curbs when we come to install them.
While Dan's digging out for our resin, I have levelled the whole frame up, and now we're going to start installing some 4-inch posts every metre.
When it comes to the posts, I'm going to be doing something called a half lap. The reason I do this rather than just bolting directly to the frame is because I think that it gives a better support. So I set my saw at half the thickness of the post, and I also used my table saw to cut out most of that joint, and I just finished it off with a hand saw, and then we can slot that underneath our frame, and then we attach it using some timber locks. So we got out the auger to dig the hole for the post, but unfortunately the deck is too high and I haven't got the extension for it. So out comes the shovel and it's back to a bit of manual labour. So I was super excited about doing one. Unfortunately, I've got about another 35 to 40 to dig.
Even though we've levelled the whole frame, we're going to go back around as we do each post and just double check that everything's perfect before chucking in some postcrete and then moving on to the next.
I set up my laser on the post, you can just see it in the background, and that stayed there for the rest of the job, and I just kept checking the posts. Here you can see I'm not actually digging a hole because this is where our water and electricity comes in, so I made a little pad and boxed it in. That way I've still got a post, but I haven't got to risk digging down into those cables. And while all of this is going on, Dan starts to dig out for our waste pump that we're going to be installing.
Now we've got our hole all squared up, it's time to prepare our pump station.
While Dan is preparing the pump station, I should explain what this is. So, you know the old saying, you can't push you know what uphill? Well, that is true. So we need this pump station to get the waste from the bathroom uphill, because this building is about 3.5 meters lower than where the waste is situated at the house.
That is the tank all prepped up, ready to go in. Now we're going to mix up some concrete to put a nice base down for the tank to sit on.
At this point, it was about 5 PM in the evening and we all just wanted to go home. But unfortunately, we had booked in to have the resin done over the next couple of days. So we had no choice but to get this pump station installed and backfilled. So me, Brad and Dan got on with creating this 300mm concrete base that had to be completely level before dropping in the pump station itself. Once that was in, we still had to fill that up with water and install the waste pipe so that we could actually backfill it with concrete. So Dan got on with levelling the pump station, filling it up, and then we could backfill it.
It got a little late last night and we couldn't film because the cameras weren't picking up much, but we have set this in with 300mm concrete base and then filled it up halfway and let that set overnight. Also, Dan, what else have you been up to with the drainage?
So basically we've got the 4-inch soil pipe installed on 100mm P shingle and surrounded. We've managed to get the flexi in from the pump, which is run up to the corner position where we need it. Now what we're going to do is get the second pipe in, which is the outlet from the pump, laid in the trench, backfill it with P shingle, level it off, job done.
Something like that.
Oh my god, that is so loud.
That's so loud.
Yep, you did just witness 3 grown adults screaming down a pipe. So once we had finished messing around, we started to unreel that large cable that's going to be returning the waste uphill and installing it into our pump station. So just like most push fit stuff, this is the same, but it's just a lot bigger. I believe this is about 67mm or something along those lines. So we install it before getting it into our trench and backfilling. So we push the shingle over the top just like we did the one below it, and that blue pipe, for those of you wondering, that is not water. That is just a bit of spare of water pipe that we had left over, and we put it over the flexi cable that comes with the pump station just to add a little bit extra protection to the cable.
Now that the pipes are fully protected in P shingle, and the concrete has gone off from last night, myself and Brad are going to continue and fill in around this tank with concrete up to this line. Let's get it on.
While Brad and Dan got the pump in, I was still digging holes. So I was trying to use the auger as best I could, getting it in at an angle just to try and help remove some material, but most of it I was having to do by hand. And while this was all happening, Dan started to fully backfill that trench because it crossed over where our resin was going.
That is the mini pump station completely installed. If anyone's looking for any drainage or this type of stuff, look up Quattro Civils. The link is in the description below.
Remember I was saying about double checking all of our levels? Well, where this is sat on the mud on those temporary feet, this corner has actually dropped 20 mil. So that's why it's important to always double check as you go around. So we're going to get this lifted and get that post concreted in. Me and Dan then created this little lever just to help lift the weight of that deck. We did that both sides, and it was time to do a few more posts on this deck build.
The poo tank is now installed. We are going to crack on and get all our lines set for our edgings for the resin.
Although Dan already did a set of lines, that was for the dig itself. These are more accurate, so these are going to set the height, and they're also going to make sure the resin finishes square to our deck build, because we want everything to tie in together. So we're going to make sure everything is nice and flat and nice and square, and then we're finally ready to start prepping our base.
As you can see, we've got all the string lines in now. So what we're going to do, knock up some ballast, get them edgings placed in line with all these string lines.
So this just shows how important it is to have yourself some string lines set up nice and flat, nice and perfect. Because we've got nothing going in level, you couldn't use a level to set these curbs in place. You need that line. So Dan starts to set his curbs to the line, and the only time he whips out a level is to set the top and the front, and then he works his way the other directions on that corner, so then he's set, ready to do the 2 long runs in these curbs.
Now we've got our corners perfectly square, we're going to start working our way down the line.
Brad jumped on the mixer. Yes, Brad was actually doing a little bit of work this day, and Dan just continued to lay in these curbs. So I had to make a little plan with Dan because he was about to wrap round where the deck is, and I hadn't finished doing my posts. I know, I'm slow. It takes me a long time to dig a hole. So as he got towards the deck, Dan actually had to stop and then go to the front and start going around the other way. So normally you just continue on, but you know, we have to work together on this project. He's trying to keep out of my way and I'm trying to keep out of his way.
So what I'm doing now is basically backing up these curbs. So what that's going to do is lock these curbs into position so that when the vehicles come in and out, they're solid and going nowhere.
Because this is Matt's house, who knows what's going to happen on this pad. So Dan needed to make sure that was super strong and going to hold that resin in place. And while that was happening, I was still adding bracing to the deck. So as well as the posts that we're doing on the outside and the inside, out here where we've already got the posts, I've put this bearer in, and that's going to help take the extra weight that's going in this back corner, and you'll see exactly what that is a little bit later in the video. With the bearer in, I add in 2 more posts on that front section, getting out of Dan's way so we can add in some more curbs, and I also add some along that front edge where he is now so that Dan can get on with finishing those curbs.
This man has been helping me get the perfect mix all day. Am I a professional at mixing?
Almost.
Oh my! What are we saying out of 10?
9 out of 10.
9 out of 10. He's being generous.
You're right, Mark was being generous. It was more like a 3 out of 10.
Now all our edgings in, what we're going to do is start getting the base prepared. So we're going to spread some of this hardcore, making sure it's all locked in nice and tight, then top it up with some tight one, ready for the resin.
You wouldn't necessarily need the hardcore, but we slightly overdug this, That was because we went to levels of ground that wasn't actually the finished level, it was where we had put oversight. So we just filled it up with some tightly compact boulders that had come out of the ground already before laying in our Type 1. Now for those of you that like things nice and neat like Dan, this next bit is going to drive you insane just like it did us. When we ordered our Type 1, for some reason they sent about 7 different colours, so it just didn't look great, but it all does the same job.
We found our new helper, look, it's Rob.
We've got Robbie in, we've got Jake in.
Wouldn't it be the home improvement channel if we didn't get people to help us?
That's the name of the game.
Rob? I could have swore that was Machine Gun Kelly. Well, anyway, so with the guys helping, we get on with preparing the base, ready for our resin, and that is all the curbs done and all the prep work complete and compacted, ready for that resin to go on top.
As well as posts, we're also creating a bearer. So what that is some posts through the middle of this span here, and it's going to take any bounce. So what we do, we set some posts in. We've got ourselves some 6x2, so we're going to lift that up underneath so it's nice and tight all the way up. And then I'm going to fix it into the post. So I've got one side
and one on the other side. So we put a total of 2 fixings on each post. And the way I install the posts on the middle is to dig the holes and then attach the post after. That way I haven't got to worry about lining it up.
So far what we've done, we've got our single 6x2, we've got 4 posts, so I don't tend to span them any more than 1 metre. So this is slightly smaller. Now we're going to put a second plate the other side.
And it's the same process. We lift it up nice and tight to the joists above and then add 2 fixings on each of the posts before nailing down those joists into that bearer.
So the reason I nail in, just spiking them down, is because if any of these are not actually bearing down at one point and you walk on it, you might get like a tapping noise. So if you just spike it in, it's always making contact and you won't get any creaking or noise.
And that is the bearing complete. We actually added 2 to this little section because of the extra weight that's going to be going on top. And once that's in position and we're happy everything's fixed in place, we can get ready to add in our postcrete, which is a little bit awkward now because we're trying to fish in between those joists. But we get it done, and then me and Liam have a little jiggle on the end of the deck to celebrate.
Now that all our posts are done, we can start to install some hangers.
This may seem a little bit over the top, seeing as we've already nailed the frame together, but for the cost of a hanger, the extra strength you gain, it just makes sense to always add them in. So we're using our Plastering PPN, saves you so much time when installing anything with twist nails, making sure that every joist that can have one gets a hanger, and we fill in all of those nail holes with those twist nails.
That's all of our hangers installed with our twist nails from our PPN gun. We're now going to use the angle grinder and cut all of the tops off.
You can buy hangers that you don't need to cut down, but this was all we could get at a time, so it only takes 10 minutes to cut them all down, so it wasn't really a big deal.
With all them cut down, I've got one more job with the frame, and that is to install some structural screws anywhere I couldn't get a hanger. So this one's next to a post, so I'm just going to go straight through the end, and that's just going to make sure that that one is fully secured. And also, on this little section, obviously I can't get a hanger on that, so I'm going to do the same. I'm going to go straight through the side and then into this bearer here. And then that way, that's not going to go anywhere.
I went through and added all of the structural screws wherever we needed them. I also added the structural screws where the 2 sections of frame were added together.
Now we're going to protect the top of our joist using some deck tape.
Deck tape is basically an alternative to bitumen that a lot of people use. So some people paint the tops, some people tape them. And when I say some people, it wasn't us, because we roped in Hanna. And then after we roped in Hanna, we also roped in Liam to tape the deck. So we pretty much did nothing on this section.
Really coming together now.
It really was. Another thing this tape does is create a shadow effect when you look in between your deck boards. So it adds protection and visual looks.
It's time to start installing our resin, and before that we need to prepare this base.
Before we got the cameras out, Dan's already started forgetting that we're filming it, Dan.
I'm sorry about that.
Dan, apology accepted. So previously we installed all of the curbs and our type 1. Now it was time to move on to granite dust. The purpose of this is to fill any voids in that type 1 because we want an absolutely perfect top layer ready for the matting and the resin that's going on top.
Quick tip, what the guys have done, they've notched out a bit of timber so they can get the surface perfectly flat.
So on shorter spans, this is a quality idea and I'd love to take the credit for it, but it was actually Dan's from DB.
The purpose of the granite dust that they're putting down is basically to get the surface perfectly flat. This is a lot easier to get flat than your typical type 1.
It's important to take your time on this part because we want this to be absolutely perfect and we want to end up with about 20 millimeters from the top. So using that timber method, we go over the whole thing before recompacting that finished surface. Traditionally, you would actually need a concrete or tarmac sub-base, but because we're using a product called Mesh and Go, we can actually lay directly on the type 1 and granite dust. With the base ready, it's time to move on to protecting our curbs. So the resin will stain them if you don't protect them, so we get some duct tape all along the top, and it's time to start cutting that mesh we was talking about earlier into manageable strips. So the guys cut them down and it literally just sits on top loose and it's cut net to all of the edges, and we can cut around all of the posts.
What we're doing now is putting this triple layer mesh directly on top. It lets the water drain through and it's really, really strong.
That's the matting complete. When it comes to resin, it's always a good idea to spend more time on the preparation because that's always going to give you the best finish. So with the matting done, we can move on to the resin itself, and just like the base, preparation is key. So the guys stack all of the aggregates into piles and all of the hardener and resin into sets ready to go. And once you pour those two together, they need to be whisked for a specific amount of time. Now that that's done, we can start to add our aggregates to the mixer. So when it comes to resin, each colour is made up of a different combination of stones. So we add in our 4 bags, then we add in that pre-mixed resin, and we also add in a small bag of kiln-dried sand. And the purpose of that is to add texture to the top so that you don't fall over. And then it's time to start that 2-minute timer and the resin is ready to go. As you can see, the wheelbarrow is covered in a black plastic. That's not because it's part of a murder scene, it's to protect that wheelbarrow from the resin, because once it starts to set, you won't get it back out. Another little tip that the guys gave me was to mark the floor with line paint every meter. That way, they've got a guide for when they're pouring out that resin. So a specific amount of mix should get them to that line, and it's going to give them that consistent 20mm thickness. So with the line poured, it's time to start raking it across and also troweling it out. Now, they make that look very easy, but I gave it a go and it's actually a little bit more difficult than you think. While everyone else is doing all the hard work like normal, I just want to introduce you to Mark from Resin Bonded.
We actually offer training courses.
And they actually train Dan, believe it or not. So if you want to learn about resin, his link to his course will be in the description below. If you are considering becoming an installer or even having a go in your own home, I highly recommend jumping on a little training course with Mark, because it looks a lot easier than it is, and Mark's going to be able to share some of the techniques you'll need to lay resin.
So, 3 strokes. You've got a levelling stroke, a pressure stroke and a finishing stroke. The levelling stroke, you just want to smooth it out flat, close up the stones a little bit, which is this one, and then you've got the pressure stroke, which is where you're just nipping up that stones a little bit more and compacting the material, which is where resin bound gets all of its strength from.
Clearly, Mark didn't want to show you the third stroke, but that's alright. I've got loose lips and I'll share everything. So that finishing one just gives it the perfect finish on top. And a few other top tips he gave me is you don't want to over trowel it because that can cause issues. Another top tip he gave me, never be tempted to add in your aggregates to that mixer before you're ready to go. Because if those stones are rattling around inside the mixer, it can actually cause them to get slightly crushed and cause discoloration. I've got Dan here from Composite Kings and he's just dropped off a load of composite decking.
And if you want any composite decking, the link is in the description below.
And obviously it will look a lot better when it's not in a pile like this. As well as composite decking, Dan also dropped off a composite balustrade, which you're going to see a little bit later on. But before that happens, I needed to modify the frame because we've changed the design. So originally we was having a single picture frame border, but we've actually changed to a double picture frame border, and that'll all become clear why a little bit later on. So we add in our blocking for the sides and we also add in some blocking for the miters, and obviously we need to re-protect the top of all of that deck just like we did with the rest. I thought that was the decking complete, but we're going to find out that it actually wasn't complete, and I'm going to have to modify it for a third time a little bit later on. Even though the deck is complete, we've got to add some additional blocking, and this is to take the balustrade posts that need to be screwed down at the end. This balustrade was actually Dan's suggestion, so we needed to add in blocking because the way it's designed is it fixes down to the deck at the end, and obviously we don't want to rely on a little thin board. We want something solid underneath so that when people are leaning on it, they don't go overboard. That's all of our blocking complete. We're now going to run some cables for some very special LEDs that you'll see a little bit later on. The most time consuming part about this whole setup is planning. We need to make sure all of our cables were in the exact position we needed them. Otherwise, when we come to install our posts, nothing would line up. So the balustrade system is designed with maximum 1800 centers. So we've done the whole design around that, sharing out all of the spacings. Blocking is done, cables are in. It's finally time to start putting on our composite deck boards. And that's going to consist of two different types of board. We've got a solid board and we've got a hollow board. The solid board needs to go around the whole perimeter. The reason is it's exposed on the edge. So with a hollow board, you've got a groove that you can see if it's exposed. So we use this around the whole of the outside, and that gets fixed directly through the top with some stainless steel color match screws. So we screw that into the framework below, all the way around, cutting all of our miters, and then we can move on to that second layer of border, which is the hollow board, and that's actually installed using some clips. So we install some starter clips ready to put in our first board, and then on the second side we use a slightly different style of clip that locks in the opposite side of the board. When it comes to composite that's fixed down using clips, you need to plan how you're going to lay it. So we actually only installed the back and left side of the border on this section of deck. That way we had access to all of the clips. So we're going to lay out away from that border, and then once all the infill's done, we can start to look at the final section of border. Two sides of our border are in. We're now going to start to install this LED track. So Lee from Allco has designed this track, and it is completely unique. It becomes a part of the deck. So it slots inside that tongue that you'd normally install the clips into, and that is now going to take LEDs at the end. Because we're using the LED tracks, see this little slot that we've got? It's not in the end. So I'm going to use a rebate car, which is this, and just basically recreate that slot so it can slide over the tracks. These tracks are the reason we decided to go for a double boarder. So they're designed to go inside of a hollow board, and because we've got the solid board on the outside, we needed to go over to a hollow on the inside. So running that double boarder allowed us to install the tracks. And plus, I kind of like double boarder designs anyway. So with that track installed, we can move on to clipping the rest of our hollow board, installing a clip on every single joist that we've installed. And not forgetting to add 3mm expansion on the end joints, because composite, just like timber, needs space to expand and contract. Once we had set up with our boarder, the inlay flies down. This bit takes no time at all.
It's really coming together now. Breaking news! The weather's fantastic and we can't wait to take our trousers off and put some shorts and t-shirts on. It's a beautiful rainbow. And it's in the garden.
But there's no gold or leprechauns. My childhood has been ruined.
Now that everyone was absolutely devastated that there was no gold at the bottom of the rainbow, we moved around to the back of the building where Liam started to hook up that electric cable that we had run in. And because of the size and run that we had installed, this actually wasn't the easiest of tasks.
I don't know what these are. What do they actually do?
Well, their purpose is just to seal up, well, one, to seal up the hole,
yeah,
and it creates like a dustproof and weatherproof like seal.
Yeah.
And then two, you also earth in the armourings on the armoured cable.
What poor Liam doesn't realise is explaining stuff to Brad is like speaking to a brick wall. So what he just did there is just waste time. So with Brad out of the way, Liam cracks on with installing all of the armoured cables and starts to populate that consumer unit.
It is a bit of a mess, but everything's all stripped and everything's in order of where it needs to go, but it might not look like that, but trust me, it is. The earths are all connected now. They're all in their order that they're going in. And next are these bad boys. These are RCBOs, residual current circuit breakers with overcurrent protection, to be precise.
Whoa.
Although Brad sounded super excited about that, I can guarantee he has absolutely zero idea what Liam has just told him or showed him. So Liam gets on with populating that consumer unit, and my lord, what a nice job.
For now, I think we'll have to call it a day.
We're gonna have to shut
But we've got the RCBOs in, the line and neutral conductors are all connected, but I think we better get out of this rain now. Yeah.
Main part of our deck is laid. However, I have made a little bit of a mistake when I've done my measurements, and it's finishing a little bit too short. So when we put our front on, as you can see, it's not going to look very good. So we have come up with a nice little plan, and that is to extend the front by adding some more 6x2. We're going to do 2 lots, and that is going to make it land perfectly.
Although I would love to shift the blame for this mistake to someone else, unfortunately this one was all me, so I get on with extending that frame using some 6x2.
Now that I've fixed my mistake and extended the frame, we can now get the last of the boarder in.
These miters I've left. The reason I do that is because I wanted this deck to finish on a full board, so it's easier to leave the border long, infill the middle, and then cut that miter exactly where it needs to be. So I get that cut, install the LED track, and then we can start to install the outside of the border.
We was going to get the rest of the border in, but we've changed our minds. We're going to install this side here, and that way we can ensure we're going to have the exact same overhang, and then we'll install the rest of the borders.
So that's exactly what I did. I installed the border along the building and also along that back edge, but I left the other 2 edges open. So just like when we installed the other section of decking, we need to remember we need access to the clips. So you need to plan out how you're going to lay your border in. So we need to be able to slide these boards in and clip them down. I also did a lot of the cutting on the deck with my skill saw, rather than going to the chop saw, and that was purely just to save time walking back and forth.
And while Phil is getting the rest of the LED track on around that side, I want to do a massive shout out to Allco Lighting. If you want any LED lighting, make sure to go check them guys out.
So like Brad said, Allco are awesome. He designed these tracks from scratch, and his LED system that goes in these tracks is also unique to him. And we've used them a few times. You won't get better. So with the tracks installed, it was time to start infilling that middle section of deck. And like the front, once you get to this part, it absolutely flies down. You just install the clips, push the next board on, and on to the next you go.
With these clips, I just want to show you, they're two-sided. So normally you put them in with the single tab out, but on a join like this one here, you want to put the two screws out, so that way it holds both boards. So when we clip that in, it's got a tab on each of these boards, and then we'll put two screws and it'll hold it down nice and tight. So we've got the two big sections of decking in. We're not doing that bit just yet because we need to start pulling in the rest of our boulder. But before we do that, these rough miters that I did, we now need to cut this so that it sits in between.
There's a few different options when it comes to joining decking. Some people like to do miters, but for us personally, we like to put a board in between. Because you get expansion and contraction, it just looks a lot nicer when this stuff starts to move if there's a solid board. And just like the rest of the deck, I'm cutting this all out using my skill saw. And remember, because we've got that LED track going into this, I need to re-add that little groove into the two ends.
That's all prepared now. So next step is to use our chalk line, and them little marks I made, we're just going to ping a line on both sides, ready for the track saw.
So when we marked out the two ends, we also added a little 3mm gap to add in for that expansion. Ping it with a chalk line, set the depth on our track saw, and we can cut all of this out. So you could cut each board individually and then place them in, but I just find that if you get a track saw at the end, you won't get a neater finish. With that cut, we can add in some starter clips to the two sides, and now it starts to make sense why we leave the front open, because I can slide that board from the outside in and it's fully clipped into position.
Now that that's in, we're going to carry on with our LED strips, so they're going to go all the way around like that. I'm also going to follow them down this side here, and I'm going to stop on this corner, and I'm going to do the same with the border.
To install the tracks, you literally slide it into the groove, and then we just add a few self-tapping screws to hold it all in position, and we can start installing the outside of that border for the final time using the clips on the first section and those stainless steel screws on the outside. And that's going to leave us with a nice little overhang, because that's the way I've designed it. I want the deck to slightly overhang the front.
That is as much of the border as we're going to install. We're now going to get on with installing the rest of the main section. While I'm just getting all these full boards in, going through here, I just want to show you what Brad actually gets up to. Literally 90% of the day. I don't know if you can see. Oh, I'm really busy, just organising. So now you know the truth.
I do stuff. It's like up here though. Like he does it, so it's like boom, 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 caveman. Ooh, me up here.
Sure thing, Brad. I think we can all guess what's going on up there.
Now that the whole thing's been infilled, I'm going to use the track saw and cut all of the ends ready for our border.
Just like the mitre we cut, sometimes it's easier to leave the boards long and cut them back with a track saw. That way you're going to get a perfect cut every time. I then run the router back through it because we need to get that track installed, and we can start finalising the border. This bit was a little bit tricky because we had to go through those posts. But as long as you take your time and make sure your cuts are good, it's not too bad. And now we can get the outside of that border fixed down with those stainless steel screws, and the top of that deck is on.
Remember when I built this frame and I said something very heavy is going over this section? Well, here it is. Over the weekend, Hannah and Matt have had this really tiny hot tub delivered. So now that that's in place, we're going to get on with adding the balustrade to this deck.
Because we are having one of Allco's unique track systems installed to these posts, we need to drill out the bottom plates. So we get all of those drilled, and that's going to allow us to feed through our power cables. We then put them through the posts, and then we can attach those plates to the posts themselves.
Now we're going to get the rest of the posts all stood into position just like this one, and then we'll go back and fix them all down.
The reason I do it in this order is it's going to allow me a little tiny bit of adjustment on each post, because I want the spaces to be exact. Because we've shared out the gaps all around, we want everything to look uniform. So we measure all of the spaces and we start to pilot through that top board before using some timber locks to go down into the blocks below. Remember that we installed those at the beginning. Well, this is why. So now when someone leans on it, they're not going to fall over and send me a solicitor's letter and take me to court. Once they're bolted down, we can slide over the little collars and it's on to the rest of those posts.
With all of our posts in, we now need to look at the balustrade itself. So the first job is to cut the rails down to fit the spaces we've got.
So with this system that we got from Composite Kings, the top and bottom rails are pre-assembled, so we just chuck them in the chop saw and cut down the two ends.
That's the top and bottom rail cut to size. With each kit you get some fixings, so these are going to slide in the ends and they then go in the post, and we also get some self-tapping screws.
So we remove all of the protection from the post, and then we need to remove the little sleeves that slide in the side, but we need to put the small one back, so that's going to space that bottom track off the bottom of the floor. So once that's in, we can install the plastic clips, and then it's finally time to start sliding in this balustrade system. So we're really careful when we slide this down because we don't want to damage anything. And once that's in, we get all of the protection removed, install 2 self-tapping screws. That's going to stop it getting removed in the future. And then we can slide in the 2 longer sleeves, ready to start slotting on our composite spindles. With all that in, we can put on that top rail. So it's the same system, same process. The only difference is you have to line up all of those spindles. Once they are aligned, you give it a little whack and you can put in 2 more of those screws and cover them up with those sleeves.
So as you can see, we are putting the caps on, but that is only temporarily because we've got some LED tracks going in here. If you wasn't having the LEDs, that would be a complete bay.
So as you can see, we was building up each bay as we went. So these 2 are the same size, but as you went around the corner, the spacings changed slightly, because remember at the beginning, I told you, you've got a maximum span of 1.8 meters, but we wanted equal gaps between each section. So these are a different size to the front, and so on and so forth. So we just kept doing it in bays. We found that was the quickest and easiest way. And as we went around, the more we put in, the more amazing this system started to look. You don't necessarily need balustrade, but on this particular job, because the ground ran away so much, you ended up with nearly a metre drop. So this was absolutely necessary on this deck job. So not only is it functional, it just looks amazing.
That's the balustrade all done. Now we can start cladding the front of the deck and close it all in.
So what you just see me do before that was extend the front of those posts. So I wouldn't have needed to do that if I hadn't have made a mistake in the size of the deck. So I got that extended, and then we could finally start fixing on the cladding, making sure we only do it when it's absolutely hammer it down with rain. To attach this cladding, we're using those stainless steel screws again. We're just screwing through into the post behind. So if I hadn't have made the mistake that I did, these would normally screw straight into the post. And while all of that was happening, Liam went round the back of the building again to start finalising that consumer unit, so we could finally get some power in this building and stop running extension leads all over the place. Now, although we are showing you what Liam's doing here, obviously this isn't a job you should be tackling by yourself. If you're not an electrician, you need to get an electrician to do this. This stuff can be super dangerous. So we let Liam get all of that connected, and we can finally start looking at getting some power on in our building.
We've got a nice switch disconnector. It's massive actually, the switch disconnector, because we've had to have a 50mm cable because the run is about 200 metres up there.
They have seen us dig this hole.
Yeah, massive. So we've had to go 50mm cable to get the supply down here. Our fuse board, a couple of little armords out.
Let's get on with something else. A very big day on the build today. We have Allco Lighting here. Clive and Lee come to fit the LED strips into the posts and all round the decking.
I'm going to show you how quick and easy it is to put our lighting kit into this post. So this is the profile that we designed. We slot this into the post and our lighting slots into this slot right here.
So you remember those removable sleeves that we used earlier to install our balustrade? We also removed that so we can install Lee's track, so it goes into the same place.
So this is the LED that's going to be going in the post. All I'm going to do is cut this and I'm going to solder on a nice little cable at a right angle so it goes in the post lovely.
Normally, Lee would have these pre-made at his warehouse, but we wanted to see how it was all done, so he sat down and soldered one in front of us so we could see how it was all built, and then he got it slid into that post, wired into those cables that I'd already installed, and we could put on the caps for the final time. Once this system goes in, it just looks like it's already part of it, so it doesn't stand out at all until you turn them on, obviously. So with the post installed, we could look at getting our decking strip installed, which is the same thing. The LED pushes down into it, and then they're wired in to the wires that I'd already run into the corners. We ended up with 4 cables because we need to make sure we've got enough power to each section. Lee and Adam have finished installing all of the LEDs, but before we show you how good all of that looks, we need to move on to installing a stretched fabric ceiling.
But first, we need to install these tracks.
So as well as LEDs, Allco also do stretched fabric ceiling. So this is super unique. It looks amazing, which you're going to see very soon. So as part of the process, the first thing we need to do is install tracks around the whole perimeter of where we want that stretched fabric ceiling. So we're going around our posts, and we're also going across that whole open section of roof. The trims are all in for the stretched fabric ceiling. Lee has done a runner because he couldn't be bothered to do any more work, but don't worry, Adam has stuck around, my main man, and he's going to show us how we install this stretched fabric ceiling. So Adam got the fabric out and started to get into his first track, and he was explaining to me that the most important section of installing this fabric is to get it set square on the first track, because that's going to make it a lot easier for the rest. So they get that first one temporarily hooked in, and then they can start to pull it across that ceiling. Now this wasn't the easiest job ever because we had a jacuzzi in the way, and also the deck doesn't go the whole span. There's a big drop on one corner, but the guys got on with it, used some ladders to get up high enough, and started to stretch it all across. As they work their way around the ceiling, they're constantly adding tension, and then they go back to that first track, pull it out and re-stretch that again as well. Once the tension's all in and they're happy with it, it's finally time to start trimming off all of the excess.
It's really coming together now.
Not quite sure what I was doing there. I think I was just holding an end of the material just to feel busy. But Adam cracked on. So this little section here, we've got a lot of diagonal support. So it was quite complicated to go around. So this wasted quite a lot of time in the day. But Adam is super good at fitting this stuff. So he got it done and it looked amazing when he was finished. So once it was all tucked and locked into position, he went round and cut off the rest of the excess. And then he used this roller device, which, if you ask me, it looks like a pizza cutter, but he assured me it's definitely not. And don't use one of those because you'll rip it. That is the bulk of the ceiling done. Now, Adam and Freddie are going to move on to these little details like the beam. At this stage, I had to whip out the uni lights because time was ticking. But the guys were not giving up. They just kept on going. So they got those beams wrapped. Started on the top, pulled it down and tucked it in, and the finish on those was amazing. The whole thing is absolutely flawless. Originally, this was going to stay open, but Lee suggested doing this, and I'm so glad he did, because it's just elevated it to a whole new level. Before we clad any more of the front of our deck, we're actually going to be starting on our steps. So we've got a big step that goes all the way, and we've also got a little half step because the ground slants all the way down. Steps look complicated, but they're super simple. It's just a box with 300 center noggins. That's our first frame made up. Now we're going to mark out for 3 posts, and that is what's going to hold this step in position. So let's get digging. So I use the step to mark out where I want the post, move it out of the way, and I can dig some shallow holes, only a couple of 100 mil, that's plenty. That's my 3 holes dug. I'm now going to put my piece of frame in position, temporarily fix it here, and put a temporary foot on it so I can make the permanent posts up. So I get the frame in position and add some temporary feet so that I can measure and cut for my posts, remembering to put in those half lap joints, and that's going to allow me to attach my next step directly to the previous one. That's all 3 posts in, so now I'm going to postcrete them, and we can look at getting this covered before moving on to that little half step, because as you can see, we're close to the ground there, but we've got a big old gap on this end. It turns out someone had left the bags of postcrete out, so they were all gone off. So I just added the little bit that I had just to temporarily hold it. And I'm going to do it again later on. That's our first step set. So temporarily set, we need to top these holes up. But we can now move on to the smaller second step. So it's going to go from there where I've just dug, and it's going to finish here. And that's going to help with the gradient of the land around it. I built up that smaller section of step and added it to the previous one, but you'll see later on I actually modified this because I just wasn't happy with how it looked. That's the 2 steps built and in place. Before we concrete them in, we're going to carry on cladding the front of our deck. Although we started this a lot longer ago, time and weather just kept getting on top, so while we had the space in the day, we got this job finally wrapped up and covered in the front of that deck.
First day.
Oh, I wonder who does the actual graft. Oh, you won't get boots like this these days, I tell you. Don't make them like they used to. That's most of the front on. On our last balls, we need to scribe them in because the ground is not level. And the way we do that, we get a really cheap labourer to hold the board in position. And then we're going to use the same piece of board and a pen. So we just hold that on the ground, and then we're just going to mark with our board all the way through.
That's Phil's line, and we're going to get that cut off.
He means me. I'm going to get that cut off.
Yeah, him.
And that's exactly what I did. So I got out my skill saw and started to cut down that scribe line. And because of the method we used, it fits perfectly, get it screwed in. And that is how the front of the deck now looks. Perfect. That's the front all cladded. Now we can move on to concreting our steps into position. And I'm also going to be extending the side because I've decided it's going to look a lot better if that wraps around. With some new bags of postcrete purchased, we fill up those post holes, and I also extend the corner so now the step can wrap around. That's the steps installed, and also the posts are concreted in. Now we can start to install the deck boards on top. Just like the deck itself, I've designed the steps so that there is a small overhang on the lips. I just feel like it will tie in better that way. So we use solid boards on the steps on all the pieces, no hollow boards, and we fix it all down using those stainless steel screws, and the steps make this whole thing look amazing.
now that the deck's complete, it's time to get it clean. And that is why I'm here.
The deck's here, mate.
You didn't say do the deck. You've been telling me not to get the deck wet for the last 20 minutes.
Poor Jimmy. Don't worry, Jim. You get used to Brad, but it just takes a very, very long time. So we called up Jimmy, and apparently he said just because he cleans cars doesn't mean he cleans decks. But we told him no excuses, and my main man Jimmy hopped over and done an absolutely blinding job, and this thing looks brand new again.
Are we going to cheer like Christmas?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah!
Wait, it needs to be darker.
Yeah, you just set fireworks
Can we do it
off.
later? Can we pretend this didn't
Yeah,
happen?
but do it later where it's really pitch black. And
Can you delete that bit?
Time to install our downlights. Our first job is to find them cables, and lucky enough we did a plan in the beginning of this build.
Making yourself a plan when you run your cables is so important, because when you build and plaster, there is just going to be no way of finding them again.
Phil has marked out the first lot of downlights, and we're also installing speakers. So Phil's marking them out right now. These holes are going to be cut out slightly wider.
And while you're marking, it's always important to give it the old knock test.
Sounds good. But it's looking good, bro.
Let's cut these spotlights.
Look at that, Phil's doing his job right, we've got a cable.
I didn't doubt myself for 1 second, and I'm not sure why Liam was doubting me. So yes, Liam is back, and he's drilling out for all of our downlights and retrieving all of our cables. So in this room, we went with 8 downlights, and that came down to the roof joists above. And we also had 3 more in the bathroom. This build is going to have a lot of smart devices. So I've got Charlie from Lightwave in.
We're going to be supplying smart switches, sockets and LED drivers.
And that is going to make this build epic. So what Charlie from Lightwave had brought us is some smart switches, which were actually needed for this build. And I'll explain that in a second. But he also brought some smart sockets. So because this building is so far away from the main house, everything can be controlled by their phone. So they can shut all the power off, or they can turn any lights they want on or off.
Next job on our list is to install the door liner.
Normally we'd install the door liner before we have it plastered, but time was of the essence on this job and the plastering needed to get done. So it was no big deal, I did it after. So we measured a width, cut down our liner, which comes as a kit. So we buy them in a particular width. We then cut it down to the size of our opening, and then we can assemble the kit to the widest opening, because we're having a standard 762 door. So we get that drilled out, get some screws in the head, which is the top part. I like to use 3 screws and some wood glue. Check the width of the top, and then we set the bottom of it to the exact same measurement, and then we check for square. And I'm setting all of this using the stops provided.
And then once you get to this stage, we need to start fixing in position. And for me, I do 5 fixings in each leg, which are these bits, and also 1 in the head.
This particular liner was not the best, I'm not gonna lie. It was very twisted, so this took me a little while, because you need to make sure everything is parallel. So we pack out one side, get it fixed, make sure it's flat, and then we match the opposite side. So I drill through 5 fixings on each side, and then we just keep adjusting, because we want an identical opening all the way down, so we've got nice reveals when we install that door.
Liner is square and level. Next job is to put on the architrave that goes around it.
So on this build, Matt and Hannah have let us have free reign, so we're pretty much doing whatever we fancy. So in the UK, Oggy and Taurus are the 2 main styles that are used. So we went with OG or Oggy. And the way I install my architrave is to mark the head, which is the top part, cut my 2 45-degree angles, and then I do the same with the legs. So I cut the 45s, flip them upside down, and cut them down to the height I need. And I actually build my architraves on the floor, and then I stick them and pin them to the liner.
That one's on. We're now going to do the exact same thing on this side.
And just like the main room, it's the exact same process. And the pin gun I'm using, in case you're interested, is a 16 gauge pinner.
Architraves are done. Before we move on to the skirtings, we're going to cut out our speakers, and we've bought this little contraption, and we was going to tell you how good it is. However, it is the scariest thing, and I do not recommend it. And if you come over here, off camera, there has been a minor incident. I'm sorry, Paint Warrior, for when you decorate. You're gonna need some filler. We are gonna use it to mark out for our cutout, and then I'll probably use the multi-tool.
Not only did it damage the ceiling, this thing actually damaged my body. So I've got actual physical harm from that. So 100% do not buy it. Use yourself a multi-tool or even a pad saw. So with the holes cut, we get our speakers installed temporarily just to make sure everything fits as it should. As well as the inside ones, if you had a watch when we wired this, we've also got 4 external speakers. So we're going to get all of our brackets on and we'll get them put on as well. So these speakers are Yamaha external speakers and they are super easy to install. You literally screw the bracket on, click the speaker into position, and it's got 2 little knobs that you wind in and it's job done. You know, like when we go to the restaurant and there's that lovely ambiance. That's what these are for. So once I'd finished reminiscing, it was time to get the last of the 4 external speakers mounted.
The garden room is now equipped with tunes. It's time to get our skirtings on.
So to match in with the architraves that we had previously installed, we are installing OG or Oggy skirtings. So these are going to tie in nicely. Now something we're doing a little bit differently is we're not using any mechanical fixings. Everything's installed using CT1 and some CTEC Superfast. The reason for that is, if you remember at the beginning of the build, we've actually got 3 courses of brickwork behind most of the walls. So pinning into them just isn't going to be possible. And because the walls are nice and flat, that adhesive is going to be plenty to hold these in position.
That's all our skirting's done. It's now time to move on to some flooring. We are having LVT, and I've got Jay from Flawless Flooring.
Yeah.
What is our first job, Jay?
Right, before we lay the floor, we've got to do a little bit of prep work.
So let's do some prep work.
So that includes undercutting our door lining and architraves to get that flawless finish, and also keying up the floor with this copper sanding trowel.
First of all, I'm going to pin string line right through the centre of the room.
And to do that, we measure 2 ends and then pull a chalk line, and now we've got a centre mark.
We have run that temporary string line straight through the middle of the room, and we're going to lay some planks in to make sure that we get even cuts either side.
So what Jay's doing here, he isn't actually installing the flooring, he's just assembling some loose or dry, and then he's putting it onto the mark, and what he's going to do is check how it's going to finish.
You don't want the border to come across the floor and have little triangles in your border, do you know what I mean? You want a nice sized plank.
So once Jay was happy with where everything fell, it was time to chalk out for our border. So we're having a lovely little border around this. So he marks out using a chalk line, and it's also going to tell him where to apply his glue. So he gets everything troweled out. I believe this is a 3mm notch trowel, and this adhesive is high temp. Because the sun's going to sit through those big doors all day, we need the glue to hold against high temperatures. And once it's glued out, it's time to start laying it in.
Now that we're all glued out, we're going to actually start installing this herringbone floor.
So Jay from Flawless Flooring is rapid at this stuff because he does this day in, day out. So if you blink, you'll miss it, because I did. Luckily the camera was rolling and Jay started to get the main infill laid out. So he's overlaying on that border because he's going to cut that after. He then trowels out the second half, ready to get the last of the bulk of the install laid into that high temp glue. My man Jay has done the main infill on the floor. He is now going to attack the border. So our border is going to be a larger format.
It's also going to have this black inlay, like so. So I'm going to let him mark that out and start cutting and installing.
When we install a border like this, we're actually cutting it back slightly smaller than the piece we're going to be installing. So if your walls are a bit wibbly wobbly, that is going to take it out of it. So we chalk a line, so we've got a perfectly straight line when we install it. So what you look at is perfectly straight, and then he scribes the main piece in after. Before he does that, he gets his bevel tool out. That's just going to round off that edge to make it look factory, and we get in our black inlay. And you'll notice there's no adhesive again. So just like the inside, everything's loose laid first. Make sure everything fits as it should, cut it to size, and then we get it troweled out and glued down for a final time.
So Jay has cut the border in. It isn't actually glued yet. So what he does it dry. That's what it's called, dry lathe. And now he's going to pull it out, glue it, and install it for the final time.
So as you can see, it's getting dark outside, and we had delayed poor old Jay so much with the cameras. Time was running out, but lucky for us, he is super quick. So he got that border glued out using the same adhesive, and then it was in with the little black detail before installing that larger format border.
So you may have noticed we have got no way of heating this room, so we've got Josh from Links AC, and he's going to be installing this.
An air-to-air heat pump which will provide heating and cooling here.
So with any garden room, air conditioning, in my opinion, is a must. And lucky for us, we've got Josh from Links AC, and he is going to install us a bad boy unit to keep this room usable.
Josh has got the main mounting bracket for the inside unit on the wall, so now they're going to prepare that unit and then get it put on.
So with the air conditioning unit, it comes with two small sections of pipe that need to be extended. So Josh got those extended, and then he let me use this weird tool to get them all straightened out before lagging them up, ready to be fed out of the core hole he had just done in our wall. So lucky for me, I got to be a part of that, and I got to feed it through out the back in all the bushes before Josh locked that unit into the plate that he had installed and started working on the trunking around the back. That's the inside all done, but there is actually two parts. So this unit here is what does all of the work, and that is going to go round to the back of the building. So the lads got the unit pulled round the back and sat on a concrete pad, and got all of the pipe work and the electrics connected, ready for testing. That's the whole system installed, so Josh is now going to test to make sure that we haven't got any leaks. So Josh got out some strange tools and started doing some tests.
So what we're going to do is leave it for an hour now to make sure there is no leaks.
With the leak test complete, he then moved on to evacuating the pipe work to make sure there was no moisture in the system that would affect the refrigerant gas. And while he was doing that, we sat down and had a rest.
The aircon is on. Massive shout out to HVAC Wholesale for supplying the materials today, and also a massive shout out to Links AC for doing all of the work. If you want some AC, hit the link in the description below.
And that was it. We finally had our very own R2-D2 in the garden room.
We're going to start installing the bathroom, but our first job is to grout these tiles.
Before the grouting can be done, we need to remove all of the leveling clips, and they are literally just smashed off using a rubber mallet. And then Brad mixes up some grout, and you'll see soon enough, like every other job, it's soon passed on to someone else.
This is a wash boy, and a wash boy, I don't know what it does, but it keeps the brush clean while cleaning the grout.
The clue is in the name, Brad. Wash boy.
Time to install our extractor fan, and I've roped in DB to give us a hand.
Brad getting someone else to do a job again? Never. So poor old DB has been roped in to do Brad's job, and that was to install an extractor fan.
Just in time. Come on, mate.
What?
You can touch the electrics now, mate.
Liam's here again to save the day.
I think Dan has been hanging around with Brad too much. Poor old Liam's now ended up with Dan's job. So an extractor fan in a bathroom is necessary, so we have got one, and all that's going to do is keep the moisture levels down.
Now I've saved the day again, I'm going to leave the rest of the bathroom for Dan to finish off.
And Dan was soon back to his former self, tackling all of the jobs, and the first on that list was to install the toilet inside the little unit.
Now we're going to start installing the shower. First things first is get the control unit mounted on the wall.
So in this shower room, we are using a Triton Envy that we got from Easy Bathrooms. So this comes with a nice little controller that sits inside of the shower enclosure. Once that's fixed on, we can then move on to the rest of the shower unit. So there's a little valve that bolts to the wall, wire that up to the mains, and then we can put the head itself on that also comes with a little handheld one for when you want to wash your fancy locks.
With that pipe now connected at the top of the field, we are moving down to connect these pipes into the bathroom.
As you can see, everybody was on site at this point. Mr. Mark Tiff come back, and it was finally time to start connecting up that bathroom inside so we could start getting everything turned on.
Now the wastes are done, we're moving on to installing the cold main.
So with the cold main, that gets installed onto the back of the building, and it's also going to get insulated, as you can see, before dropping down into 15mm and getting teed into those 2 feeds that go into the bathroom. So what Tiff's using there is a press fit gun, and that extra little valve you see on the end was for an outside tap that we decided to add after. With the outside complete, it was back inside where we could get our basin prepared and also get our tap installed onto the quartz top that's going onto the unit. So we get that fixed on, get the grub screws done up, and then we get the unit bolted back to the wall, get everything assembled.
Let's go, follow us. We're going to turn the water on.
We're at the stop clock.
Did you bring anything to get in?
Can you hear water? Yeah.
Listen.
We want it on full steam ahead.
See if you can beat it down there. Run.
I ain't doing that.
Fully watered up. Right, let's put that.
With the water switched on, we purged all of the air out using that outside tap that we had added. And finally, the building had water. You know what that is down there, didn't you?
Great success!
Once me and Dan had finished celebrating, it was back inside to fill everything up and make sure everything operated as it should with no leaks.
So we've now connected the drainage up to the existing drainage of the house, and we're now going to check that the pump from the garden room is working.
Thanks to Cotterill Civils for supplying this pump station, we could now make sure we could push you-know-what uphill.
It's a very big day on the build because we have Paint Warrior and Paint Warrior Junior decorating this build.
So when it comes to decorating, there isn't much Kevin from Paint Warrior and his son Len do not know. They are absolutely brilliant at this kind of stuff.
Before spraying the ceiling, we're actually going to be protecting the downlights using some plastic bag and masking tape to make sure that we don't get no overspray on it.
Like Brad just said, this is getting sprayed. So Kevin and Len are getting everything prepped, so everything's getting protected, and they've also given it a quick sand down before mixing up some primer for the spray machine and then roping in Matt to spray the first wall, which is kind of surprising because Matt never wants to help us, but he's happy to help Kev. So once Matt had got bored of that first wall, Kev moved on to the rest, done all of the walls, and then it was on to the ceiling. This isn't the top coat, it is just primer. Because we've got brand new plaster, you have to make sure you prime it first.
All the plastering is sealed. We've raked back all of the cracks. We're sealing the cracks with the Zinza guards. And now when that dries, we're going on with the Easy Fill.
So with any timber build, there is a high likeliness that it will shrink back on the plaster and you will get some hairline cracks. It's not unusual to happen within the first year, and that's exactly what happened to us. So we got that raked out, and then Kev got it filled back using some Easy Fill, and he also cleaned up any of the corners because he is super fussy and he likes everything to be absolutely perfect.
Now that the ceiling's fully dry, we're actually going to go around and put back all the spotlights and the speakers.
At this stage, the ceiling had 3 coats of paint, and Kevin had asked us to put everything back so that we could see what the lighting's like on the walls. That way you can see what the finish is going to be like.
The ceiling is complete, the woodwork is prepped and primed. Now we're going to get some colour on the wall.
So Hanna actually picked this colour, handed it over to Kev, and he had it made up in the brand of paint he likes to use. And he gets everything cut in first using his very own brushes. So I don't know a lot about decorating, but I have tried his brush and it felt wonderful. So if you like painting, go check out Paint Warrior's brushes. I think that's what makes him so good, if I'm honest.
This is the last piece to the bathroom, which is the shower glass. And it's really light.
And the reason it's so heavy is because it's a full enclosure, and we picked one that's going to match the shape of the shower room. Nothing. I've got to have to look at the instructions. Once I'd read those, I wasted some time explaining it to Brad.
Yeah, that's sweet.
20 mil. Within the next 2 to 3 working days, there'll be an opening at the Home Improvements channel. You must be skilled and not an absolute fool. I then sent Brad on a pointless exercise so I could get him away from me so I could get on with the real work, and that was to install the first 2 rails of this enclosure. So you start by fixing the 2 rails to the walls, and that's going to take the first pieces of glass. That's the 2 main rails installed. Now I'm hoping it is smooth sailing with the rest. And it turns out it was smooth sailing. The first 2 sections of glass slid into position. I then locked them in using some retaining screws that were supplied with the kit, put the caps on, and then I could put the 2 bars that went top and bottom. So these eventually are going to carry the glass door. So these are the hinges for the door. We put on some of the waterproofing strips before sliding the door into position and tightening everything down. Not too much though, because it is glass. And the last and final job to the shower is to put the handle on. And just like the door, we don't want to be over tightening these screws. Not gonna smash. Yeah, get out of there, I've got to take myself a little cheeky shower. That's the bathroom suite complete. Before we finish, we do need to get it masticed, but I've also got to install some accessories that we picked up from Easy Bathrooms. And we're going to be starting with the toilet roll holder. You just sit down and if it's a bad day. These accessories are super easy to fit, couple of screws, and then you just tighten up the Allen keys. Now that that's on, I'm going to put another little loop here for some hand towels, and then I'm going to put a bigger bar here for some big towels so you can wash off all that swag. And who wants to be covered in swag? So we got that bar installed and the bathroom was starting to come together. Next job on the inside is to get a door installed on that shower room, because without one, it's just a little bit strange. And if you don't have a door, that's nothing against you, but personally, I like a little bit of privacy when I'm in a bathroom. So we're going with an oak cottage style door here, just ties in with the rest of the room. And we're installing 3 hinges on that. That's just my preferred method. Some people only install 2, and there's nothing wrong with that either. That's our hinges all fitted. Now we're going to mark out for our handle and our lock. So we start off by setting out for our handle. This is a separate handle and lock combination. Sometimes they're combined. So we drill that out, use our router to get the depth for our plate, and then we could drill through for our spindle. Once that's all fixed down, it's time to move on to the lock itself. So it's pretty much the same process, but it's a lock. So this is a thumb lock. Like I say, you can get these combined, but we like the idea of them being separate. Once they're installed, we can get that fixed to the frame, and we can drill out for the receivers that are going to take the lock and the latch itself. With both of those plates ready and installed, the last job on this door is to install the stops. So I set mine using a credit card, and just pin them in. One last job in the bathroom is to box in this little shower unit. So we've called in Jake, and Jake is going to be showing you how to cover it up. So we actually met Jake while we was at Matt's house, and what better way to strengthen a friendship than to make him do work that you should be doing. So we got Jake to make up this quality little box section, and as you can see, he really does know what he's doing. And he's also come up with a fantastic idea for this, for the front. Because this shower unit needs to be serviceable, you can't just box it in with no access. So he cut up a door using some MDF, and then he installed some really strong magnets. So now the front of this box can be removed.
So that's the boxing done. I'm off to do my own work.
Now it's time to actually seal the bathroom, and this makes it a lot more usable, and we're using no other than Martin Coots.
When it comes to masticing and sealing, Martin knows pretty much everything there is to know, and he does one of the best jobs you'll ever see. So we could have had a go at this ourselves, but if you ask me, it's always worth getting a proper mastic man to do this job, because it's the finish that everyone's gonna see. And as you can see there, that little section is not an easy bit to do, and he did an amazing job of it. Once that was done, we can show you how cool all of that smart switching is. So these control all of the LEDs around the building, but they also have multiple functions like dimming and changing the colours on the light bar we put outside. And they can also be engraved with anything you like. With all that done, Kevin starts to get wrapped up inside. We do the final touches, and just when we thought it was all over, Matt come in and surprised us by giving us an Audi R8. How amazing is that? What better way to end an epic build?
Lovely rain that we never get. The weather has changed again and it's slightly raining, but we love it. It's now raining in the UK. The weather's fantastic and we can't wait to take our trousers off and put some shorts and t-shirts on.
Yes, the build is epic, but more importantly, we got to make some new lifelong friends and worked with amazing people.
Hey, you're telling us away.
Thanks for watching. Remember, like, subscribe, and catch us on the next epic build.